start streaming. Let me go to my channel to make sure everything's okay, because...
Oh, this is going to be live?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Well, all right. Should be live now. Are you ready?
I'm ready, sure.
Okay, let me just make sure that everything's set up properly. This YouTube does not make this simple.
Yeah. Are you going to tweet this out? Maybe we should both tweet, like, you know. Oh, this is going to be live?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay, we are live and we are running. I am here with, maybe I should give it a minute to put out the link first.
Sure thing.
Post that to Facebook. Pop out chat so that I can see the chat separate from the live stream. Okay, I am here with Caleb Maupin, who is a fairly long-time friend. Oh, people are saying that the title of the channel is wrong. Everything that can go wrong does go wrong. Okay, here we go. Now the title's right. All right, now, after numerous false starts, we can finally get to it. I am here with Caleb Maupin for a discussion on Marxism. He is a journalist for RT, and he is the author of several books, including a recently released Getting Rich Without Capitalism, America's Way Out. How are you, Maupin?
I'm great. How about yourself?
I'm okay. I can't complain.
Good. Glad to hear that. Glad to hear that.
So what was something you wanted to talk about?
Well, I wanted to talk about first because, you know, I mean, to anyone who follows the work of either you or I, it's very apparent that we don't agree with each other. You know, you're a Maoist third worldist. I'm more into socialism for the 21st century. But it's interesting because you and I, we are both part of the political left. We both have leftist views. We don't agree on much, but we respect each other. And I respect you. And, you know, and it was one of my biggest pet peeves because for a while, you know, a few years back, in every left-wing circle, it became just the trendy thing to do to bash you, you know? No, I'm not kidding you. Anywhere you went, any socialist, communist, young people around, people say, oh, you know about that Maoist rebel news guy? He's awful. He's this, he's that. And I would say to these people, you know, why don't you make videos? I'm serious. You know what I mean? I mean, it's like more people listen to you and watch your videos than listen to any communist group in the United States and read any communist magazine in the United States, read any publication. You're doing it. You know what I mean? I may not always agree with you, but you're actually doing it. And if these people have a problem with you, they should outdo you. They should make videos of their own that are more popular and make better political points or whatnot. They should outdo you. And the same for me. If people don't like what I'm saying, if they think that I'm wrong, if they think that the way I'm presenting leftist ideas is not correct, then they should outdo me. Too many young people who get into these kind of ideas just want to sit on their computers all day long and bash the people who actually do stuff. you know, and it's kind of a pet peeve of mine, in all honesty, you know, and the fact that you make these videos and the fact that you endure so much, you know, I don't know what you want to call it, people leaving you nasty comments and insulting you and such. The fact that you endure that and you continue to make videos and promote your interpretation of things, that's really, really commendable. You are driven. You know, you have a drive. You want to get something done. You have a project. You run a very popular YouTube channel promoting your ideas, and I think that's to be applauded. And if five more communists out there were doing the same thing that you were doing, we'd be in a much better world. You know, and that's kind of my perception. There's this weird culture that's developed of internet Marxists, where it's anyone that actually goes out and does anything, anyone who doesn't just sit on the computer all day long bashing other people is a sellout and a phony. And that's just, if you want to actually change the world, that's just a foolish way to think about things.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of people talking smack about you too. Normally, it's just stupid stuff. Like when you started working for Press TV, it was like, oh, what are you the Ayatollah's propaganda mouthpiece now, which is kind of the same thing that I got.
Oh boy. Well, I do my job. There you go. I mean, I've done interviews on Fox before. I've done interviews on CNN before. Does that make me a voice of U.S. imperialism? I don't think so. I mean, my views are my views. I do the work that I do, and that's that. I don't get that. There was a time when I was with Press TV where I would go to, I covered a lot of protests, and I would go to these protests, and there'd be somebody at a rally. Don't do an interview with him. He's with Press TV. And I would say, well, would you do an interview with CNN? And they'd say, oh, yeah, they're balanced. I'd be like, really? So you won't do an interview with somebody with a network that's connected to Iran, but you'll do an interview with somebody connected with the main network of American capitalism and imperialism. So you're a revolutionary. How? I don't quite follow this. People really don't think these things out, and I'm not a Shia Muslim. I don't practice the Islamic faith. At no point have I ever been a voice for the Ayatollah. I've always had my own views. I'm not a voice for Putin now. I do my job as a journalist. And I'm a political analyst. I write political articles in addition to the journalism that I do. So there you go.
Yeah, I mean, I have never said anything on Press TV that I did not believe. And
same for me.
They have never asked me to say something that I didn't agree with.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the same here. I mean, it's like, this idea, and it's so bizarre that this, that people apply this standard to anti-imperialist media, but they don't apply it to the mainstream media. No one, if somebody goes on BBC, no one says they're a voice of British imperialism. And it's just understood that they had their views and their message, and they went on BBC. There's this double standard. It's very, very, very sad to hear it coming from a leftist. You expect it from the mainstream population. People think that, people who think that the Western capitalist countries are the best in the world and that the anti-imperialist countries are pure evil, you might expect them to talk this way. But to hear people that are, presenting themselves as anti-imperialist or anti-capitalist talk that way is quite disturbing.
Yeah, I mean, it's just strange. All I'm doing is giving the anti-imperialist perspective, and largely that's what you do too. I mean, what's wrong with that? That's what we're supposed to be. That's what we're supposed to be saying.
Yes, indeed.
It's just ridiculously. It's just strange to me, especially when somebody goes, "Oh, you're just a joke. You're just some guy on the internet," and then get on Press TV, and then start making fun of me for being on Press TV.
You may be a guy on the internet, but more people are listening to you on the internet than listen to a million people who go to tiny little rallies or sell newspapers on the street. And it's a weird thing about the left. I mean, one thing that happens to young people who join these, Marxist-Leninist political groups is like the first thing that happens when you join this group is if you've got a YouTube channel, you have to shut it down. If you've got a blog, you got to close it down because, the party speaks for you now, democratic centralism. And I mean, in the conditions of Tsarist Russia, that made sense. It was, everyone had to be very secretive and there was one voice that represented the party. But we're in a different period now. And all over the internet, people are making videos and making tweets with their perspectives. So why is it that that when you join an organized political leftist organization, they shut you up? They silence you. That's a gift to the right. I think that we should have as much, political literature, as much videos as possible promoting, our message. I don't, and I don't think that people need to be suppressed. If people want to argue with people about how they do it, argue they should do it differently, that's one thing, and that they should cut out a correct political line, that's one thing. But this idea that we got to be silent, that's just bizarre, and it's a weakness for the left.
Yeah, I mean, I've always encouraged people to start their own channels too when they want to. I mean, go ahead. I mean, I've got nothing to worry from other people broadcasting their opinion as well. Like, by all means, go ahead.
Sure. And I mean, and occasionally you make a mistake. People make mistakes in this world. Maybe you take a position and then after a little while you realize that was not the correct position to take, and you change your position. I mean, that happens too. And we all live and learn,
Yeah, like originally I was against Gaddafi when the whole thing started because I was younger, didn't know as much as I did now, and then I really stood by on Syria. I didn't say anything until I was absolutely sure of what position I would take, and frankly, it took me too long to pick a side. And they say in politics that if you sit on the fence too long, you're going to end up with a fence post in your ass.
I haven't heard that one. That's clever.
I took too long on that, and then I defend Syria. Now I take that stance. Like, you don't have to like Bashar al-Assad. You don't have to like capitalism in Syria. You don't have to like him. You don't have to like the government. You just have to respect their right to self-determination. That's it.
Sure. I mean, I'm not sure that Syria is capitalist, and I'll tell you that much. During and this goes back to the Libyan War. When Libya was being, the USA was funding the NATO rebels and all of that, I was part of a certain Marxist-Leninist organization in the United States that was, they were defending Libya on an anti-imperialist basis. But I actually went and read the Green Book, Gaddafi's, political writings. And, Gaddafi was certainly not a Marxist-Leninist, and he didn't believe in Marxism-Leninism. He had his own kind of Islamic socialist ideology. But if you looked at the economic foundations of how the Libyan state functioned, the means of production were operating according to a central plan and not for profits. And the Libyan state, was based in these things they called popular committees. Gaddafi, he was not ideologically a Marxist, but I don't think that you could call Libya under Gaddafi, capitalist. And that was the difference that I had with this group I was with, because they insisted that Libya was a bourgeois nationalist state. And I couldn't quite understand. I said, what's the difference between Libya and Cuba? And they couldn't give me a real difference. They gave me, well, in Cuba they have this ideology, but they when it got down to it, they couldn't explain an economic difference between Libya and Cuba. And if you look into the Ba'ath countries, they did not believe in Marxism-Leninism. They believed in Ba'ath Arab socialism, but the major centers of economic power were all controlled by the state. They had 5-year economic plans. There wasn't, other than, not saying that they were Marxist-Leninists, there wasn't much difference between them and the countries of the Eastern Bloc or the Soviet Union or Cuba or DPRK, and that really made me start to question, if all it takes for a leader of a country to say I'm a Marxist-Leninist, that's not really materialism. That's saying that ideas define reality, and that's not a Marxist understanding. I think that, when capitalism emerged in the world, it didn't have the same ideology everywhere. The French Revolution, it was, they were absolutely opposing all religion. They converted all the churches into temples of reason until Napoleon came in, and then they became Catholic again. The Protestant Reformation took power in some places and created capitalism. To say that a different social order will have the same ideology every single place it goes is pretty absurd in my view. And I think socialism exists all over the world today, but it's a different kind of socialism. And I don't think that the Soviet-style socialism is ever going to return. I think that just like the Paris Commune. The Paris Commune was the Paris Commune. That was what, Marx called it, the first dictatorship of the proletariat. Well, the Paris Commune, if you had been in 1917 in Russia and we'd been going around telling everybody, screw all these Soviets. We don't need Soviets. We don't need workers' councils. We got to create the Paris Commune. What is this, worker and peasant alliance? We got to go back to the Paris Commune. You would have been living in the past and people wouldn't have taken you seriously. And I feel like for people to be going around saying we need to restore the Soviet Union or we need to restore the Soviet political model is that kind of behavior. I think socialism does exist in the world today, but it's a different kind of socialism than existed during the Cold War, and the Cold War socialism was quite different than what existed in the Paris Commune. I think that socialism is evolving and adapting based on material conditions.
I would say that that's largely true. I think socialism is going to look differently in different places, and I think that goes for a lot of other ideologies as well. They don't always look the same. Like democracy doesn't look the same, or bourgeois democracy doesn't look the same in the United States as it does in Canada. Like I mean, speaking as a Canadian, we'd cringe if there was a lot of that stuff going on here.
Absolutely, and that Marxism understands that it's property relations and how the means of production function. That's what defines the nature of a society, whether it's capitalist, socialist, feudal, or whatnot. That's what it's about. It's not about what ideas the leaders espouse. It's about the economic foundations.
Yeah, I think that's a fair enough point. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's one of the conclusions I'd come to. And at the time, it was interesting because I came to these conclusions, and there were people that were in this particular organization I was in on the other side of the country who weren't interacting with me, who came to these conclusions about Libya, about Iraq, about other countries, and had never talked to me about them. And we met and we discovered we'd come to the exact same conclusion. And I've talked to other young Marxists who seem to have come to this conclusion. And I've traveled. I've been around the world. There's a lot of countries that are not part of the international capitalist system. They're not part of the Wall Street, London, German, Western capitalist system, and have economies that are planned by the state and don't function according to the profits. Karl Marx, he wrote that he wrote capitalism is the anarchy of production. Friedrich Engels said that under capitalism, the means of production only function as preliminary transformation into capital. Or Mao put it, he said, in capitalism, profits are in command. That's the nature of capitalism, is when in capitalism, housing isn't built so people can live in it. Houses are built so that landlords and bankers can make money from selling them, from loaning people the money, from renting them out. Under capitalism, food isn't produced so that people can eat it. Food is produced so that agribusiness can make money, so that profits can be made. I mean, the great example, there's a friend of mine here in New York City, and he was in Union Square here in New York City during the holiday season. It was really cold. We had record low temperatures here in New York City. And there was one of these big stores, I think it was Burlington Coat Factory, and they had a bunch of coats, these warm winter coats, and they were slicing them up and throwing them into dumpsters, right? I mean,
Yeah,
it's
I've seen
freezing.
that practice.
Yeah, and what was that about? Well, it's because those I mean, it's a big waste as far as you and I are concerned, but that's because those coats weren't produced so people could wear them and be warm. They were produced to make profits. And if they just threw them in the dumpster, someone could take them out of the dumpster and wear them and not buy them from the capitalist. And that's the nature of capitalism. Capitalism is production for profits. And socialism is when we take control of the major factories and the major industries and the oil wells and make them function for the good of society with rational planning, not the chaos of the market or the anarchy of production. And this idea that socialism has been a big failure, Sputnik, who was the first country in outer space? I mean, if you look at what went on in the Soviet Union during the 1930s, how they went from being one of the poorest countries in the world to being a world industrial power in just a few short years. I mean, this was huge stuff. It was quite amazing, and you can't say that that's capitalism.
No, not really. No. I've even experienced something similar to that. I had a temp job for a week at a paper recycling plant, and it was I saw the astounding amount of just greeting cards for various different holidays or occasions or whatever that would come through, tons and tons of them, perfectly good, but they were shredding them up and recycling them anyway. Well, I guess I could say at least they were being recycled.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, that's, yeah. And again, what a waste, and it's but they're cutting them up because they didn't make them, they made them to make profits. I mean, that's the irrationality of capitalism, and that Marx's book Capital, which is his definitive study of how capitalism works as a system, basically comes to the conclusion that this chaos of production, this anarchy of production, it drives the capitalists to increase technology, to make technology increase. But under capitalism, the more you increase technology and the more efficient it becomes to produce products, the less you pay your workers, right? Because they're more easily replaceable because of the technology, because they don't need to be as skilled. And so, and you don't need as many workers. The jobs are eliminated by machines. And that's what capitalism does. And so the more efficient and the more advanced technology becomes under capitalism, the more poverty you have, right? That's the understanding. And that ultimately, the only way this contradiction can be resolved is that, we need to have the banks, factories, and industries controlled by the people. And that the workers or the population as a whole, the people should control the centers of economic power, not a small group of people that are trying to make profits off of them. That's the socialist message.
Yeah, they're just raising raising the organic composition of capital for the sake of it. I mean, it's not anything controversial to say that capitalism uses technology to put people out of work rather than alleviating people from work. And we very often hear the line, well, they used to say that about, elevator operators, and then, other jobs appeared, but we're not seeing other jobs appearing when they're replaced by machinery. This is not the same thing as, say, perhaps the mid or tail end of the Industrial Revolution. We're not seeing the same thing. We're talking about jobs that are being permanently replaced now, not new ones coming up.
No. World War I and World War II were both preceded by gigantic leaps in technology and in the means of production. World War II, it was assembly line production. It was the breakthroughs of Henry Ford, what they called Fordism production. Those breakthroughs ultimately led to a Great Depression because, millions of workers were put out of work by this new level of efficiency. And that resulted in the rise of fascism, and eventually the Second World War. And what we're living through now, compared to what Henry Ford did, the computer revolution is such a huge leap in the means of production and in terms of technology. This is like nothing that's happened before in human history. I mean, I print my books a lot of times with Amazon Create Space, and there are no workers that are involved. One person pushes a button and the book comes out, right? That's something we haven't seen before. That's huge. And capitalism can't handle this. And that's why we have a global, a refugee crisis. Millions of people all over the world who don't have a place at the assembly line and are fleeing their home countries. That's why, I'm from Ohio, and most of the people that I go to school with have left Ohio because there's no work anymore. There used to be all these factories. There used to be, the town I grew up in, it's actually where they make Smucker's jelly. I don't know if you've ever had Smucker's jelly.
Yeah, we have it.
Yeah, I grew up in a small town in Ohio, Orville, very nice place. That's where they made Smucker's jelly. Well, nowadays, the amount of industrial jobs in these areas don't exist. And so young people are going to California. They're going to New York City like I did in order to get by. The economy of the United States has just imploded because of the computer revolution. And all over the world, the entire world is reacting to the fact that this computer revolution has drastically changed the means of production. And, one thing that needs to be pointed out is that there's a little bit of a problem when we talk about the Cold War and we talk about socialism. Because, we Marxists, we have an understanding of human history that it's an advance. It's like a train speeding forward, like historical progress. And that for most of human history, we were hunter-gatherers. We hunted and we gathered, right? I mean, we were in the woods, tribes of 30 to 50 people hunting and gathering. And then we got too good at it, essentially. We started making spears to hunt animals with. We started picking up on the patterns of plant growth and figuring that out. And pretty soon, because we human beings were so good at hunting and gathering and had advanced technology and our knowledge, there was a scarcity of animals and a scarcity of fruits to pick. And because of that, we had to, move to a higher mode of production and start, domesticating animals and growing crops. And that was the first revolution, that, the birth of feudalism and slavery, a higher stage than hunter-gatherer primitive communism. That was the first revolution, a leap in the means of production. And then capitalism came along with, the birth of another stage, right? You had the new the Silk Road, the original Silk Road from Asia that was bringing in goods. You had the printing press, which was actually invented in Korea, but they started using it in Europe. And pretty soon technology had advanced in Europe and made the feudal system outmoded. Feudalism was no longer necessary, and the merchants and the traders emerged to become the capitalist class, the industrial capitalist class. And so you had a higher mode of production, industrial production, and that replaced the system of feudalism, which was based on subsistence farming. And the problem, though, is all throughout feudalism, peasants were fighting back. Peasants were so oppressed. They were basically like slaves. They were the property of the landlords, and they would fight back and revolt all the time. And sometimes they would seize control of little swaths of land. In Germany, there were all these peasant uprisings. They'd create communes. They'd redistribute the land. And sometimes this would go on, and maybe for 100 years they would hold control of the land. But eventually, feudalism would take them back over. Why? Because even though they had overthrown the landlords, they still didn't have a higher mode of production. And ultimately, the best way to run the feudal system, or the best way to run subsistence agriculture is with feudalism. Feudalism was more efficient in running that kind of production. So, even though they would rise up, they'd take control, well, they'd be overtaken. And the thing is, we're in a period where, when the Soviet Union came into existence, the Soviet Union, they rose up, they took control, but the steel mills in the Soviet Union produced steel in the exact same way that they made steel in the United States. And, and that happened in every socialist country. It was the capitalist mode of production, industrial production, reorganized in a planned way. So it wasn't capitalism. You couldn't call it capitalism. But for socialism to really triumph, it had to be associated with a higher mode of production. And that is the interesting thing, is that, the Soviet Union, they took control of those steel mills. They operated them not according to profits, but they were still operating on the same mode of production as Western capitalism. And that was ultimately the problem. And that's why, in many cases, we've seen the capitalists be able to encircle the socialist countries and overthrow them. But with the computer revolution, we now have a leap in the means of production that capitalism can't deal with. It's creating a global crisis. However, the planned economies around the world, in places like China and other places, are actually latching on to the computer revolution and making it work to the benefit of all society, and using the computer revolution to advance their planned economies. And that is the period we're living in. Things are quite different than they were during the Cold War, because a higher mode of production exists. Capitalism cannot handle the computer revolution, but a rationally planned socialist economy with 5-year plans can. And that's the period we're living in, and that's the crisis.
No, I would definitely agree with that. We are headed towards a very difficult time ahead in terms of managing the technological evolution that's coming up. I hate to bring it up, but quantum computing is going to really change things too. It's going to make such tremendous leaps in computing power that it unrivaled by anything that has existed in history. And that's going to allow us to do things that will be completely unheard of. I mean, we talk about the planned economy of the Soviet Union, and that was before computers. That essentially had to be done by pencil and paper. That's to me, doing that is just simply unfathomable. But the ability of computers, and we talk about Allende and cyber socialism, and using computers to calculate the economy and what's going to be possible in the future with quantum computing is just absolutely astounding.
Sure. No, the title of my book that you mentioned in the introduction, I called it Getting Rich Without Capitalism. And the reason I picked that title is because one thing that just drives me up the wall is that people think that socialists want everyone to be poor. This is a very common belief among libertarian types that, that what we want is we're angry. Whenever we see anyone that has wealth, we're like, oh, I'm so mad. I'm so jealous that you have wealth. I want you to be poor. And I've had people say that socialism is about making everyone equally poor, blah, blah, blah. No, socialism is about raising the level of material abundance and raising people up out of poverty. And that misrepresentation is just, it kind of drives me up the wall, in all honesty, because and the sad thing is, I think that a lot of the middle class cultural left in the United States does actually worship poverty. Mother Teresa, she said that poverty is beautiful. I mean, that's disgusting. I mean, anyone who's actually ever lived in poverty would want to slap her in the face, But there is this trend of hippie type middle class leftists who say, oh, everything's too material. get rid of your TV, and people think that that's what a socialist is. But the reality is that socialists want people to have more stuff, in my view. And in fact, I would say, the Communist Manifesto talks about getting rid of private property. But my understanding has always been that Marxists distinguish between private property and personal property. Private property is something that you use to make profits from, right?
Yeah.
Whereas personal property is just something you use. Your phone, if you use it for your personal pleasure or your personal use, that's your personal property. We don't want to touch that. What historically socialism does want to touch is those giant steel mills and those giant factories and those major means of production, the banks, means of communication, means of transportation. These things that are essential to running society should be operated for the benefit of all of society, not a small group of people that just have a piece of paper that says they own it. That's the understanding. And there's just a lot of confusion out there. And the other thing, it's very funny. I saw there was a tweet by one of the guys at InfoWars, and he tweeted out that anyone who believes in socialism or communism must hate themselves. And I thought, my goodness, does this guy think Stalin hated himself? Does this guy think Mao hated himself? Hugo Chavez? Fidel Castro? Seriously. It's very, very odd. And I feel like there's a growing gap between the first world left that in a lot of ways does worship weakness and does worship weakness and is triggered by strength. And there's a gap between them, kind of what people, I don't know what you want to call them. There's different names people use, but the first world left, the kind of people that are going to stop Trump rallies in the USA, there's a big gap between them and people around the world who fought for socialism in the 20th century and currently. There's a big gap, and we're seeing a rise in that. The left in the United States seems to be more and more focused on social and cultural issues, and the kind of things I'm advocating here. I've had people tell me that this is fascism. I can't comprehend how this is fascism. I'm saying
that doesn't make any sense.
But yeah, if you advocate a planned economy, you're a fascist. Being a leftist is about wanting to do your own thing and everyone just being nice and sitting in a circle and saying kumbaya. This is really confusing to me. And I got into Marxist and leftist politics when I was quite young, growing up in Ohio. Nobody in my family was in the Communist Party or the Socialist Party or anything. I discovered this stuff on my own. And I went in the United States, and it's funny, I didn't even know there was a Communist Party in the United States. I assumed that there wouldn't be because whatever. And I got on the internet, and lo and behold, there were like 200 communist groups. And so I got involved in Marxism. And as I got involved in those groups, I started to realize that what I had been attracted to, what I had read in the writings of Marx and the writings of Lenin, and what I was attracted to was very, very different than what these kind of new leftovers from the 1960s who were running the various Marxist groups believed. There was quite a big gap, and that surprised me. It's very interesting. We're in a time of transition. I think that the Communist Party of the United States during the 1930s was a very beautiful thing. It had a lot of problems. I'll give you that. But this was a group that when people were hungry because of the Great Depression, it was feeding them. It controlled whole neighborhoods. It had people in the U.S. Congress that were elected, that were their allies or close, if not members, close allies of the Communist Party. They were key in the struggle for civil rights. Long before Martin Luther King was a household name, the Communist Party was involved. If you look at William Z. Foster, Gus Hall, these kind of people, Eugene Dennis, these organizers, they did some amazing stuff. Claudia Jones was another, this was a Caribbean American woman who was an organizer in New York City and elsewhere. Paul Robeson. The Communist Party of the 1930s was an effective, powerful organization that had a huge impact on U.S. politics. It's funny, in the USA, there's this thing where the veterans will tell, they're mad at protesters and leftists. It's like, I fought for your freedom. Well, veterans wouldn't have veterans benefits if it wasn't for the unemployment councils and the bonus march of 1931, where communists led a whole bunch of veterans of World War I to occupy Washington, D.C., demanding that they get veterans benefits, So, any veteran who gets veterans benefits owes, a debt of gratitude to the Communist Party for fighting for that. The Communist Party before the end of the Second World War, before McCarthyism, it was a major player in American politics, and its impact was very, very good. I mean, the Communist Party did a lot of good things. Now, during the Second World War, they did some stuff that was rather. I mean, they were collaborating with the war effort in ways that were somewhat unprincipled. But and you can make other criticisms throughout their history. There's plenty of criticism you can make. But if you want to look for an organization in the USA that believed in communism and had an impact, look at what the Communist Party was before the McCarthy period and before the death of Stalin. It was quite a powerful organization, and you can look at the Black Panther Party of the 1970s. Now, that was a party that represented, only the black nation. It did not represent all Americans. It only represented, the African American community, which it considered to be a nation. But they fed people, they organized people, they did things for their community that they were a household name. They had an impact. They were actually a vanguard party, and those two organizations you can look at as kind of a model. I think all these groups that are out there selling newspapers these days, they all do something good. I mean, some of them print really nice books. Some of them are really good at staging rallies and demonstrations. Some of them, are really good at working in the labor movement. But at the end of the day, none of them really matter at all. But if you want to look for a group that mattered, look at the Communist Party of the 1930s. Look at the Black Panther Party of the 1970s. These groups, they were groups that were doing, what communists should be doing.
No, definitely. I'm friends with Steve Struggle, who's one of the original Black Panthers, and I've done some research on the original 1930s style, the CPUSA before it turned into what it is today. Let's just leave it at that.
Sure. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of good people in the CPUSA, who have very good intentions. But, if you look at the organization, how influential is it? How much is it really doing much? It really functions just kind of as a wing of the Democratic Party. It's, people that are in the Communist Party, most of what they do is they're just kind of Democratic Party activists who, in addition to being Democrats, they might go to a communist club meeting once a month or something. I wouldn't say that you can put them in the same category as some kind of group that's actually challenging capitalist power. But that doesn't mean there aren't people in the group that are very well intentioned and good.
I'm sure there are good people there. It's the problem of good people in a bad organization.
Sure. There's a lot of questions to be had, but that's a big question now is, what does it mean to be a communist in the United States? What do you do if you believe in trying to build a non-capitalist society in the United States in 2018? What action do you take? That's a question we should all be asking ourselves. The biggest thing, there was a communist group, that I was affiliated with, and the way that they tried to justify themselves is they would always say every other group doesn't do anything. Oh, this group, they don't do anything. Or this group, they don't do anything. And I remember thinking about that and saying, wait a second, this group does something. They just do stuff that's a lot different than we do. Okay, we have a lot of rallies and protests. This group gets people to vote for the Democrats. This group sells a lot of books. This group works in the labor movement. The question wasn't whether they were doing anything. The question was, is what they're doing effective? Is what they're doing mattering? Does what they do actually achieve anything? Is it what you should be doing? And I realized that, and this myth that every other group didn't do anything was just kind of a way to stop people from actually questioning what the group was doing. And I realized that, and I hear that from, I go to demonstrations and interview people for my journalism or whatever, and I'll hear people say that. They'll say, oh, this group they don't do anything. I'll be like, no, I'm pretty sure they do something. They just don't do what you think they should be doing. And there's a big difference.
Yeah, that's kind of a shame, because if you've got one group that does something well and another group that does another thing well, like imagine if you actually cooperated with each other. Imagine what you could accomplish then if one group is good at going out doing rallies and another one is good at printing media. I guess it's almost kind of sense that they would be cooperating rather than bashing each other.
Well, you would think, if you read the history of the Bolsheviks, we read Lenin, and Lenin's writings, he's constantly screaming at the Bolshevik leaders. We need more discipline. We need more order. We need more discipline. But the more you look into that, you see that the reason Lenin was always screaming that is because there wasn't any discipline. In the lead up to the seizure of power in October, Bukharin and Zinoviev went to the capitalist press and announced that the Bolsheviks were trying to take power and that they didn't agree with it. And Lenin was furious and demanded that they be kicked out of the party, and he was outvoted by the Central Committee. They wouldn't even kick out two guys who announced to the capitalists that they were plotting a revolution, right? That's how little discipline the Bolsheviks had. And the Bolshevik Party, I mean, they had, all of these guys. I mean, Lenin was ultimately the brilliant one, the one who was responsible for the party of new type, but, Bukharin, Zinoviev, Trotsky, Stalin, all of these guys had huge followings among the workers. They were all very well respected. Kamenev, Litvinov, all of them were leaders in their own right. The Bolshevik Party was not a cult around Lenin. All right, these people were not out there, with Lenin's T-shirt saying, "Oh, Lenin has the way. We need to follow Lenin." That's not what they did. All of these people were respected leaders, and democratic centralism, the method that Lenin developed, was a necessity. It was the only way he could get all these brilliant thinking, dedicated revolutionaries to do the same thing. It was like, okay, we can have debate, and everyone's free to say whatever they want and to debate, but then after we take a vote and we reach a decision, then we all have to do the same thing. And that was a way that he could get all of these brilliant, dedicated revolutionaries to do the same thing and to march as one. And that's what democratic centralism was. And the way democratic centralism is practiced by American leftist groups, most leftist groups are controlled by maybe one or two or a handful of people, and everyone else just kind of goes along with it. And if somebody else comes into the group who's smart, who's intelligent, they drive them out because, oh, who do they think they are? They're not practicing democratic centralism. And this kind of distortion of democratic centralism, where people think that the Bolshevik Party was a cult around Lenin and that everyone just obeyed Lenin's every word and worshiped Lenin, that's kind of responsible for the fact that the left in the Western world in the 21st century is a million little tiny cults of personality that don't really matter for much.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have seen that a lot, where if you simply disagreeing with the party line, is enough to, like, not even saying actively trying to sabotage or ruin the party line or to go against it, but simply disagreeing with it is like a cardinal offense. And we've got, those two knuckleheads going to the capitalist president outright committing an act of treason. Frankly, it's treason. That I can't even think of a better word to say that, and I do see that from a lot of communist groups, and I don't even think that it's necessarily even groups, but I see that on a lot of Facebook pages too. I mean, I'm not a part of any communist Facebook pages or groups anymore, but when I was with them, there was a very virulent attitude towards anyone who disagreed with the general consensus of the admins of the page, where they would just virulently go after people who just simply disagreed with them. I mean, I've always just said, like just make an argument.
Well, I don't agree with you on a lot of things, but we're talking to each other. And it's funny, I mean, the word dialectic, which is supposed to be the basis of, the Marxist method, dialectical materialism, the word dialectic, it refers to, in Hegelianism, it refers to arguments, contradictions, people not agreeing with each other. That's how history moves forward. That's how, the scientific process is advanced, is through people not agreeing with each other, exchanging ideas freely, and that when that doesn't go on, you get kind of a stale doctrine that emerges in place of any serious action.
And that's a very serious advantage that the bourgeoisie have over us. They can argue over things, but at the end of the day, capital wants what it wants, and that's what's going to ultimately be the deciding factor. I mean, a lot of, at least in my opinion, a lot of right-wing ideology isn't really all that varied. They may disagree on a few core issues here and there, but essentially they're all on the same page on the most 5 major issues. And because of that, they can function much more easily than we can. And they can function with a great deal of more solidarity than we can. I guess that's maybe the curse of being, the curse of being principled.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned disagreements among the bourgeoisie, because I think we should all be reading Karl Marx's pamphlet. I believe it's the 18th Brumaire of Louise Napoleon. It's his pamphlet about the coup in France in 1851, because Bonapartism, what Karl Marx observed in France in 1851, that's a definitive aspect of the period we're living in, is that, when the economy is in a crisis, the capitalists start to fight with each other. And one section of the capitalist class will try to violently suppress other sections of the capitalist class in the hopes of resolving the crisis. And that's happening in the Western world. The American ruling class are at each other's throats right now, with what's going on with Trump, with what's going on with many things here in the USA. The American ruling class, there's a big crisis on their hands. They all want it resolved. They all want order to be restored, but they want order restored at the expense of all the other capitalists. They don't want to be the ones that have to pay for it. You know, and that's what was happening in France in 1851. And basically, this group of French capitalists who were associated with finance capital, they got together and they got, this guy who was the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, and they got together with some military leaders and they took over the government and they created like a military dictatorship. And then they started suppressing the industrial capitalists, and they created, a shorter workday. They provided hospitals for poor people. They built a bunch of railroads, and the industrial capitalists hated it. And they were furious because they were being taxed to pay for it. They were being forced to treat their workers better. They couldn't stand it. But, the Bonapartist wing represented finance capital. It represented one group of capitalists, and it was violently suppressing the others in the hopes of trying to restore order in France and bring society back into order when there was an economic crisis and mass upheavals. And that's Bonapartism. And that's what happens when you have a capitalist crisis. When the economy crashes, poor people start rising up, the rate of crime increases, wars become more likely, and the capitalists are all fighting among each other. What do we do? How do we fix this? We don't want there to be we don't want there to be a revolution. We don't want there to be disorder. Our profits are going down. They start fighting among each other. And among that fighting, you get sections of the ruling class that try to violently suppress other sections. Roosevelt in the United States, he was aligned with the Rockefeller family, the oil monopolists in the USA. Henry Ford could not stand him. Henry Ford was his enemy. And Roosevelt supported workers in occupying their factories. He supported, raising the taxes on the rich people in the United States. He protected the Rockefeller family, which was one section of the capitalist class, but he suppressed Henry Ford and other sections of the capitalist class. That's Bonapartism. That would be kind of like left or liberal Bonapartism. But, you can look at Adolf Hitler. That's right-wing Bonapartism. Adolf Hitler represented, he was a fascist. He represented the industrial capitalists of Germany, the Krupps, the Tysons, in their struggle against American bankers and British bankers. They canceled the debts. They canceled the Treaty of Versailles, and they killed all the communists and put them in prison camps. But they also were, they kicked the American and British capitalists out of Germany, and that was a struggle within the ruling class. That was fascism or right-wing Bonapartism. When there's a crisis, Bonapartist figures emerge, kind of strong men, you could call them, that are trying to restore order. And sometimes they do it in reactionary and violent ways. Sometimes they do it in progressive or liberal ways. But the ultimate goal is the same. They want to save capitalism from the crisis.
No, that's definitely the case. I think it's nothing controversial to say that in terms of that struggle today, that finance capital pretty much runs the whole system. I think that finance capital definitely does rule the roost when it comes to the United States and to Canada to a lesser degree. I mean, we don't have things to the degree of like London or New York. But I definitely do think most of the power is wielded by the finance capitalist.
Well, it's pretty clear there's a division among the American capitalists right
definitely.
now. And I think, if you look at like the Walton family, for example, it's like I believe it's some of the richest like people in terms of like direct personal wealth in the world. Every year they publish this list, Forbes magazine, of the richest people in the world. But it's BS because, if you look at it, these are people who are so poor they have to keep their money in their own name. It's like the Rockefellers aren't on there because their wealth is so tied up in such an elaborate network of trusts and foundations and cartels. They don't even know how much money they have. A lot of these, they talk about the six families that rule the United States, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, the Carnegies, the DuPonts, I think the Vanderbilts, if I'm not mistaken. You go down the line. The really powerful capitalists in the USA, they're not on any list of the richest people because they don't even know how much money they have. But there are a lot of wealthy, millionaire capitalists in the United States that are not part of the club. The Walton family, right? They own Walmart, but are they part of that club with Rockefeller? Do they own any banks? Do they own any big oil companies? No. And I think that the lower levels of capital, which are much broader in the United States, people like Sheldon Adelson, for example, I think they're much friendlier to Donald Trump. Whereas the biggest levels of capital, the finance capitalists, are much more Democratic Party oriented. ExxonMobil, the Morgans, people like that, they are much more because they can afford it, They don't mind, government intervention into the economy because they're so rich, it'll be to their benefit. They'll get the government-controlled monopoly. Whereas the lower levels of capital, they actually believe this libertarian stuff. They actually believe we should privatize everything. They actually believe everyone could be rich like them if they just worked hard. They actually believe that stuff. And so they're for more free market stuff. They don't want to pay taxes and all of that. The richest of the rich it's been in their family for generations, and they can afford it. And their they want the government involved to protect their monopoly. Like the division between the frackers, for example, the fracking companies and big oil, that was very apparent. A lot of ExxonMobil, BP, they fund a lot of environmental groups that are opposed to fracking. Now, they also do fracking themselves, but if fracking were to be outlawed, that'd be great for them because all their competitors would go out of business because they don't dominate the fracking business at this point. It's companies like Devon Energy, it's like the Koch brothers, these other companies that dominate fracking in the USA. So to some degree or other, the big oil companies that are invested all over the world and, that outlawing fracking isn't something they're completely opposed to. And that's a big division. And when the oil prices dropped so significantly in 2014, that was it was something that was to the benefit of the big major oil companies and the big banker financial capitalists, but it screwed over and destroyed a lot of what they called like the fracking cowboys, which are these little startup guys that maybe only have like $1 or $2 million. To us that's rich, but for a member of the ruling class, that's nothing. And they were just destroyed by the low oil prices. Some of them, I believe one of them committed suicide, if I'm not mistaken. These divisions within the ruling class are very, very important. And that people, that people want to say, oh, I'm against all the ruling class. I'm only for revolution. Well, that's all well and good, but that's kind of like it's like you need to get past, that's explaining Marxism like you explain things to a 3-year-old. To a 3-year-old, you're like, this is a banana. This is an apple. It's like that's how a lot of Marxists think. This is a capitalist. This is a worker. Yes, but if you really want to change the world, you have to know what a capitalist is. You have to know what a worker is, but you have to get beyond that. You have to understand the intricate, complex ways these things relate and maneuver within them to try and change the world and to try and get something. The Communist Party in the 1930s had a strategic alliance with Roosevelt. They made a strategic alliance with him because he was anti-fascist, because he favored an alliance with the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany. And through that strategic alliance, they were able to make huge strides and victories. And if they just stood there and said, oh, all the capitalists are bad, they wouldn't have had that, they wouldn't have been able to do that, And I think that we should, Mao would not have come to power in China if he had not entered a strategic alliance with the KMT, with the Nationalist Party in China. Now, they betrayed the communists, and eventually they took power, and probably the main reason the communists were victorious was because a lot of people that had followed the nationalist KMT saw that the nationalist KMT were a bunch of sellouts and that their nationalist ideology was phony. They had become puppets of the United States, and that what the nationalists had promised, a better life for China, independence for China, the only way that could be delivered was by the Chinese Communist Party. And so they dropped their nationalist ideology and adopted Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thought. And they did it because they saw that this KMT party that the communists had been working within strategically during the 1920s was phony and sellout. And when the divide between the communists and the nationalists came down, they went with the communists, it's not a straight line. You get a lot of people that say, oh, class independence. Well, yes, but you need to be strategic. We should always be going back to the drawing board and trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. And trying to measure success and failure. When communism becomes a religion, when people have the holy book and they say on the page 3 of Marx it says blank and we are going to do blank, that is not science. That's not dialectical materialism.
No, you're definitely right in that case. I don't think there's any denying the correctness of Mao's line. One of the things that makes it correct is, it literally working.
Right, but Mao flipped and flopped. You have to admit that, during the 1920s, Mao loved the KMT. He thought they were great. He was actually an alternate member of the KMT's National Committee. Then in the 1930s, he was waging an armed struggle against the KMT. And then when Japan invaded, he entered an alliance with the KMT to fight Japan. And then after the war was over, he fought against them. Mao was constantly changing his tactics based on what would work and what would not work, That was what he did. And that's ultimately how, after 25 years, can you imagine 25 years of armed struggle, the communists took power, And there were times, it's interesting, that Mao was fired by the Comintern. They would send some letter to the Chinese Communist Party that Mao, this crazy guy Mao, we don't like his ideas, he's out. And the communists would just rip the letter up because Mao was the leader that was respected in China. It's kind of fascinating. But if you look at Mao, what made Mao brilliant was his ability to organize people and work with people. The Little Red Book, I like to tell people the Little Red Book was kind of like Mao's Twitter page. It's these short, sharp statements. And the reason that they came out with it was because there was so much illiteracy in China. There were so many people that couldn't read. In order to have something that people could memorize and understand the communist ideology, you had to have stuff that was very, very short. For example, a lot of Maoist literature is written with the 3 thises and the 4 that's, the 4 great, alls, or the 5 great olds, or the 4 news, or the 10 great relationships.
Yeah, it's a very Confucian style.
Yeah, but that's also because there is illiteracy. So people could memorize it. If people weren't able to read or write, they could memorize the 4 great alls, or the 4 great thises, or the 4 great that's. And there was a whole history of that in China. And Mao knew how to apply the ideas that Marx and Lenin had put out and what was being practiced in the Soviet Union. He knew how to apply it to the conditions of China. And it's fascinating. There's a very good biography of Mao by Han Suyin, I believe. She was a novelist in the United States, and she became, a communist, and she wrote this biography of Mao. It was in 2 volumes. The first volume is called The Morning Deluge. The second volume is called Wind in the Tower. And in her biography of Mao, she talks about, Mao was an anarchist. Did you know that he was an anarchist before he became a communist? He was a follower of Peter Kropotkin.
Yeah, I do know that. Yeah.
Yeah, and that he had this group of followers that were anarchists. They were called the New People's Study Society, and they were leading boycotts of Japanese products. They didn't support Japanese imperialism, dominating the Chinese economy, and they were leading boycotts of Japanese products, and they followed the teachings of Peter Kropotkin. And that they weren't interested in Marxism because Marxism focused on industrial workers. And in China, there were so few industrial workers at that time. Most of the country were peasants. So they followed Kropotkin because Kropotkin's teachings in Russia were focused on the peasantry. And they realized that China was a peasant country. But then when the Russian Revolution happened, Mao was very interested because, look, here's a successful revolution. Well, they must know something. And Mao became a founding member of the Chinese Communist Party along with his fellow, New People's Study Society members because it was working. They said, okay, look, these people in Russia, they've actually taken power. We can learn from them. It's very fascinating.
That's definitely the case. I've even, what was it I was going to say? I was going to say something, and now I can't remember what it was.
Oh, really?
Yeah, damn it.
Well, hey, it happens to the best of us. One thing I think we need to rethink on the left is, I feel like, that a big thing on the left is what they might call ego stripping. Are you familiar with this concept?
Yes.
It makes sense. There's a place for it, right? Like when somebody, in China, for example, during the revolution, when there was a wealthy person who would join the People's Liberation Army, they'd have to clean the toilets, right? So it was to show them that, hey, you might be from a wealthy family, but you still have to get your hands dirty. You still have to do, just this, the dirty work that everyone here does. And, and it was to, kind of humble them and show them that, hey, you're no better than anybody else. Maybe you're from a rich family, but you're going to clean the toilets for the first few months that you're here, so you understand that there's no hierarchy, and that you read criticism, self-criticism, and these things are completely necessary. You need in order to build an organization, you can't have people just their ego just goes rampant, But the problem I feel like is that a lot of the first world left, they talk about, people call it identity politics or white privilege. And that a lot of young people, especially like young white people in the United States, they used to have it very good because of imperialism, because of the labor aristocracy. And, there's been a decline in the economy, the jobs aren't there. And all of a sudden, they've been promised this lavish first world lifestyle, and they don't have it. And they've got, maybe they've got their parents on their back saying, when are you going to get your life together? When are you going to be out on your own? When are you going to, and so for them to go to a communist group and have that communist group try to break down their self-esteem, they don't have time for that. I mean, they're feeling, they're feeling awful. They feel like they're not good enough. They're told that they should, be able to go out and achieve. And so when a communist group comes along that just wants to break them down and tell them they've got it too good and that they need to not like themselves so much, they don't have time for it. They go somewhere else, And that a lot of these, I worry, my fear about the rise of the alt-right and these white nationalist groups is that while the left tells white Americans that they have it too good and they need to be aware of their privilege and they should feel more guilty, the right makes an appeal to this kind of bigoted pride. And that's very dangerous, because people just don't like to hate themselves, They just don't. People have a desire. No one wants to believe their shit. They just don't. People strive to feel good about themselves. And when the left is perceived as a political entity that's all about shaming and tearing people down, people go somewhere else. And I don't think that actual Marxism is about shaming and tearing people down. If you read, it's about empowering people, and, there needs to be a recognition that people of color have it far, far, far worse than white people do. Right? That absolutely must be recognized. You need to recognize the oppression of women and the oppression of other groups. But at the same time, ultimately, Marxism is about bringing everyone up. It's about raising all of us up higher, starting with those who have it off the worst, and giving special attention to those who have it off the worst. But that's been lost. That's really been lost. And, when the message of the left to the broad masses of people in the USA is you have it too good, when that happens, you can expect the right wing will win.
No, yeah, I mean, definitely this, it seems like the left is more interested in tearing people down rather than bringing people up. And to even facilitate that, they start saying things or pushing ideas that are ridiculous. Like one of the things was, well, how can we like Marx because he's white? And then I've seen groups that claim that Marx was actually black, which that's not true.
Well, I mean, he was I guess he was Sephardic Jewish, or I mean, he had dark skin. I know his friends called him the Moor, but it's irrelevant ultimately because Marx is Marx because of what he wrote. I mean, you know what I mean? I don't.
Revolutionary science is revolutionary science.
Yeah.
A good idea does not come from a particular color; it comes from correct analysis.
Exactly. I mean, and does experience affect one's analysis? Sure, certainly, and so do life circumstances, and so do many other factors. But the idea that we shouldn't read Marx because of his ethnicity or his skin color is absurd. I mean, the question is, what were his ideas correct? And maybe, and there were some things about Marx. I mean, Marx was wrong on a few key points. I mean, he supported the British colonization of India. That was not correct. Marx, he supported the U.S. taking over Mexico during the Spanish-American War. He was not correct on that point either. He was mostly correct, but there were a few points he was wrong about. And ultimately, the book Imperialism by Lenin, it was dealing with a reality that Marx could never have foreseen. Marx, the way he saw it, was the rise of industrial capitalism would lead to the proletariat in Western countries getting poorer and poorer and poorer. And eventually, as the means of production increased, the German and British and French working classes would get poorer and poorer and poorer. And as a result of their increasing poverty, would rise up and seize control of their factories. That didn't happen. And, you talk about the crisis of Marxism in the 1890s. The crisis of Marxism and the fact that didn't happen was because of imperialism. Because the capitalists of Germany and France and Britain and the USA, instead of just making profits by exploiting the workers in their own country, started making super profits by exploiting workers around the globe. And as a result, the wages of workers in first world countries started to go up. And so the workers in the first world countries started to be loyal to imperialism because they said, hey, it's making my standard of living go up. Meanwhile,
this was one of the big concerns over the Second International.
Yeah, and the Second International, had been representing all these workers that were getting into socialist politics and being in unions. And all of a sudden, their politics started becoming very, very opportunist and pro-imperialist. Because why? Because the workers they were representing were seeing their standard of living increase because of Western capitalism. So suddenly they were loyal to their bosses against the people of the world. And that was a change. It was a material change in the basis and the position of workers in the first world, and that affected the politics. And so, that created the crisis of Marxism. And then you have Lenin writing the book Imperialism explaining what was going on. And to be fair, the Marxist narrative of workers in the first world rising up and seizing their factories, that never happened. It just never happened. Does that mean Marx was wrong? No, it means that Marx, he saw what the contradictions were in his time, but things changed. The world is constantly changing. And I think what we're seeing now is that, this labor aristocracy, this layer of workers in the first world who they were technically workers, but they made so much money and had such a cushy lifestyle that they really identified with their bosses and sided with their bosses against the people of the world, that layer in Western countries is being systemically destroyed. That's what's going on right now, is the labor aristocracy is being demolished because they don't need it anymore. The computer revolution has rendered it unnecessary. After the Second World War, the USA blew up, and there was a war. It was the USA and Germany, and most of the First World and most Western, industrial countries in the world were destroyed. And the USA had all these steel mills and all these steel workers, and suddenly the USA was selling steel all over the world, right? Because they had it and other countries didn't. Well, now you just don't need steel workers to make steel. Plus, a lot of other countries are making steel on their own. China makes half the steel in the world. So this idea that we're going to have, this layer of very, very well-paid steel workers in the United States, and that's going to be the basis of the American dream, that's gone, right? So the question is, what do you tell a population that once used to have it so good because of imperialism, and now the very imperialists that have been destroying the Latin America, destroying Asia, destroying Africa, they've now just starting to destroy parts of the first world because they don't need them anymore. What do you tell that population? What do you tell them? How do you organize them? How do you get them to see that the people around the world are their allies against these billionaire monopolists located in the Western countries? How do you do that? Those are the questions that modern-day Marxists need to be wrangling with, if they're in this country, of course.
I would argue that the main problem with that is that the system can just give a lot of the benefits back to a lot of first world people. Not all of them. Like there's no going back to the 1950s. There's no taking that golden era and giving it to everybody, no matter how much Trump tries to promise it. Mm-hmm. And that's always going to be a problem. You are going to be able to buy off a lot of first world people. I think a lot of the Bernie followers are exactly like that. They're looking for a buy-off. They're not looking for a whole new system. They're looking for the same one with a nice human face and a lot more cushion on it than there used to be. And I think that's a problem because that is a bribe that can be made. And I think
yes, but in order to make that bribe in this period, a lot of American capitalists are going to have to be taxed like crazy. And a lot of American, Rockefeller might be for that bribe. Morgan might be for that bribe. But the Walton family, they don't want to start paying Walmart workers $20 an hour. And if they pass a law to pay, to raise the minimum wage so that Walmart workers start making what steel workers used to make, Walmart is going to fund, political organizations and activism like crazy to make sure that law doesn't go through. And then you're going to have a fight within the ruling class. You can be sure of that. And that's right. There is a section of the ruling class that, the Council on Foreign Relations published one of the issues of their magazines 2 or 3 years back. This is the biggest think tank of the ruling class of the United States, the Council on Foreign Relations. They actually published a publication, and then the headline was "The Social Democratic Future of the United States." There's a section of the ruling class that is all ready to make the United States much more social democratic. But there's another section of the ruling class of the United States, probably a bigger section with a lot less money, that is ready to fight them like crazy, because they'll have to pay more taxes and they'll have to, provide better conditions for their workers, and there'll be more government control over certain aspects of the economy, and they can't stand that. It's going to be a fight within the ruling class. I think there's going to be divisions. Rockefeller, Morgan, Carnegie, they can afford a New Deal. But, the rest of the capitalists are terrified of that. It would ruin their business.
I think that they're going to have to do something to save it, and somebody's going to have to pay. Walmart can push against it, or the finance capitals can push against it, but somebody's going to have to pay somewhere. Because I think when it really comes down to it, the capitalist is going to either make less profits or no profits because the whole system is gone. And I think in the end, they are willing to make a concession so that they can at least have something.
Right.
But that battle will be something that is definitely... It's almost like, I almost want to see them go into the Terror Dome and fight it out and see that. That'd be very, very interesting, and I'd like to place some bets on that. But
well, and the interesting thing though is when these divisions take place between the ruling class, that creates an opening for the people. And that's the exciting thing, is that when the ruling class is fighting against itself, fighting among itself, they are forced to start enlisting workers into the battle. Right, and recruiting workers to kind of be their foot soldiers in the political fighting, right? And so workers who are normally told, hey, you shouldn't be part of politics, don't worry about it, all of a sudden are being told they need to get involved. and are being mobilized. And when that happens, things get interesting. You know, the Russian Revolution was largely a result of the fact that a lot of the capitalists in Russia didn't like the Tsar. They thought the Tsar was incompetent. They thought he was embarrassing. They thought he was losing the war. He did this thing with the Rasputin. It was like embarrassing Russia to the whole world. So a lot of capitalists wanted the Tsar to be brought down. So when there was a strike to get rid of the Tsar, there was a strike that took place. Normally, they would just arrest the strikers and break it. But then the Cossacks, the mounted horseback fighters in Russia at that time, went and supported the strikers. And pretty soon you had an uprising all throughout St. Petersburg and all that, and the Tsar was stepping down, right? That was the capitalists kind of entered an alliance with the workers to bring down the Tsar. And then when the new provisional government came in, led by Kerensky, there was a bigger division because some of the capitalists in Russia wanted to keep fighting World War I, and some of them didn't. And there was a big division. And there were some capitalists that were tied in with German banks and German corporations. They didn't want to keep fighting Germany. And most of the capitalists in Russia at that time were tied in with American and French corporations. They wanted the war to keep going. And so there was a division. And the Bolsheviks were against the war. That's what they were known for. They were the one party, the only major political party in Russia that was against the war. They wanted to end World War I at all costs. They were against World War I, no questions asked. And then, there was this guy Kornilov who wanted to become like the military dictator, who wanted to seize power and create a military dictatorship and continue World War I very aggressively. He tried to have a coup, and the Bolsheviks went out in the streets and organized the people to beat back Kornilov, again, in an alliance with the capitalists who were against the war. And in the process of that, the Bolsheviks became so powerful that ultimately then in October they were able to seize power on their own, all power to the Soviets. Right. But that was, they had a strategic alliance because of these divisions among the Russian ruling class about World War I, about the Tsar. They were able to maneuver within all of that to ultimately come to power.
That's a definite. I think the anti-war stance was the most, possibly the most important stance of all to have during that time. I mean, that's why they had the slogan "Peace, Land, and Bread." For people who wanted peace, the people who were starving because the capitalist system was coming apart, and land for the peasants that were held under the shackles of what essentially was essentially feudalism, and that's how the Bolsheviks were able to come into power and gain so much influences that nobody was representing the people from any of the other parties at the time. There was nothing that they could offer them. There was, it was just the same old, and
right. And you have to remember. Oh, I'm sorry. Continue.
No, I was just saying, and a part of that problem is that although the Democratic Party offers a lot to people, which is certainly enough to buy off a lot of people, in the end, it can't. They won't be able to buy them off or not. I mean, the Democratic Party never really delivers on everything that they promise, and they don't even come very close at all because they usually end up capitulating to the Republicans in that sphere, at least.
Well, what scares me in the United States more than anything is that at this point the Democratic Party is more pro-war than the Republican Party, and that's
definitely true.
Throughout the Cold War, because the communists were, it was the Soviet Union that was the enemy or whatever, there was this understanding in the USA. The Democrats wanted to negotiate more with the Soviet Union, and the Republicans wanted to isolate and attack it more. And so based on that, leftists in the United States oriented themselves toward the Democratic Party because they figured, okay, this is a group that's a little closer to what we have to say. But nowadays, Trump took office campaigning, saying that he would end the wars, America first, and all of that. Whereas now the mantra of the Democrats is Russiagate. Oh my God, Trump is soft on the Russians. He's not warlike enough. He's not aggressive enough in Syria. I mean, it's very scary. And this is a new orientation, and a lot of the Marxists, the way that they talk is they talk about the movement, the movement. And they're talking about people who protested the Vietnam War and stuff. But at this point, the people that are the movement on the left, the people that are going to those Stop Trump rallies, these people are more pro-war than the average masses of people are. The average masses of people in the United States want to end the wars. They think, hey, our economy's crumbling. We ought to focus on our own business. We don't have any place in Syria. We don't have any place in Libya. That's majority opinion. For the first time in my lifetime, I'll add. Meanwhile, your average rank-and-file Democratic Party activist is constantly reading the New York Times and believes all of the propaganda and wants the USA to be more involved. So the movement, if you can call it that, is more pro-imperialist and more in favor of the system than the people are. This is a contradiction. And if the strategy of Marxists is to orient toward the movement, they need to wrangle with the fact that the movement is in many ways more right-wing than the masses. And this is a complete shift. And that ultimately, with the decline of the labor aristocracy, there's a moment here that we're having where for the first time, Marxism in the United States, it doesn't have to be just something that's believed in by a small, isolated bohemian, people on the campuses, or it's actually something that if you said to average Americans, look, the economy is run by a group of really, really rich people who've got all the power, and we think we ought to reorganize the economy to work for you and in your own interest, and we think that we ought to stop meddling around the world and focus on building a better life for us, and we want to get along with countries around the world and not rip them off and exploit them. We want to have an economy that serves the people. I would tell you that if you said that, and you didn't say it was communism or Marxism, you just said that, I would say that probably a good 50% of the American people would agree with you.
I definitely think so.
Now, that wouldn't be the case if you said it, years ago. You'd get people saying, oh, when I was a kid, it was always, oh, well, anyone can get rich if they just work hard enough. And, oh, we are helping countries around the world. We have, people don't think that way anymore. People are far more anti-establishment than they used to be. And I mean, when I was a kid in Ohio, we used to always get a knock on our door from the Jehovah's Witnesses. You know what I'm talking about? The Jehovah's Witnesses? Yeah. And they'd be like, here to learn all about our religion. Why is it that we don't have people knocking on doors in Iowa and Minnesota and Minneapolis saying, hey, have you heard about socialism? Have you heard that capitalism is the problem? Why don't we have that?
In the South, I'd be afraid of getting shot, to be honest.
Well, maybe, but the time is here. And if you can actually engage with those people, people are open to these ideas. They just don't know what they are, But in terms of actually coming to agree with the leftist message, the American public is far closer than they've ever been in my lifetime. I'll tell you that much. This is a ripe opportunity. But if the left continues to focus on the movement, they're going to lose it. That's the thing, is the movement at this point is a dead end, and it's going. Not only is it not going anyplace good, but it's going to very bad places. This idea that we should impeach Trump because he's too friendly to Russia, that is insane. That's Joe McCarthy kind of stuff, right? How is that something? Trump is not warlike enough. That's the message of the left. Who could believe this?
Oh, but I think that a lot of people are upset with Trump for other things as well. The main Democratic push is definitely Trump, Russia, Trump, Russia, Trump, Russia all the time, all day, every day. But I think a lot of people are upset about, getting rid of, the Trump's stupid wall, the cutting regulations on basically everything. But but that's not the narrative that's being put out by the Democratic Party. The one putting out by the party is Russia, 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 which is really the shame, and that's the narrative that's definitely getting the major push inside the mainstream media, as would probably be pretty obvious.
Even though polls show average Democrats don't care about that, which is pretty much shows who runs the Democratic Party. I was. When Bernie Sanders was running for president, at first I was very critical of him. But I look back on that, and I realize that even though Bernie Sanders himself he's not really a socialist. He doesn't advocate, a new system. He just advocates, a more regulated and controlled capitalism. But the fact that his campaign really represented the fact that millions and millions of people were breaking with the Democratic Party. Millions of rank-and-file Democrats were mad.
I definitely do agree with that.
Were mad and felt like the leaders of the Democratic Party had sold them out. That was huge. Nothing like that has ever happened. Usually there's a progressive candidate like Dennis Kucinich or Mike Gravel or somebody, and they run and they lose, and then they tell all their supporters, you got to vote for the main guy, and they vote for him, and that's the end of that. But the fact that there were protests at the convention, that people were disrupting. I was at the Democratic convention reporting. I saw people on the floor of the convention booing and disrupting. It was like even Bernie Sanders told them to stop. He said, stop it. He said, vote for Hillary Clinton. And a lot of them didn't vote for her. A lot of them didn't even vote for Hillary Clinton. This represents something big, something very, very, very big is happening. The consciousness of the people is changing. And there's a huge opportunity here.
Yeah, I definitely do agree. I was very anti-Bernie Sanders because I don't want people to be jumping on board with somebody who's just going to give them the, the nice reforms. I mean, I want people to jump on the side that's going to smash the system. And even then, Bernie Sanders essentially did just end up sheepdogging for the Democratic Party. I wouldn't be surprised if he honestly thought he could win at one point. Like maybe he thought that he could win the nomination to lead it. I don't think he really realized how the Democratic Party works, and maybe now he's got a more realistic vision of how that is. I mean, there's some reports that he was outright threatened into stepping down from the nomination and allowing Hillary Clinton to win. I mean, I think that might have come up from the Podesta emails for I think, but I'm not really certain. That was quite a while ago. But I think a part of maybe that might have been Bernie's naivete, that he really thought he could take on the Democratic establishment and change things. I mean, if anything, that's not what the Democratic Party does.
I mean, ultimately, Bernie Sanders was not technically a socialist in that he didn't advocate a new system.
No, he didn't.
But what became very apparent is that if you talk to Democrats, people that are in the Democratic Party, most of them talk like Bernie Sanders. However, the people that run the Democratic Party, the people that have the power and make the decisions in the Democratic Party, talk like Hillary Clinton. And that is what was revealed by the Bernie Sanders campaign, is that the Democratic Party is rigged internally. The Republican Party is too, no doubt about it. But at the end of the day, that was a huge revelation. And leftists, people like you and me have known that for years. But that was revealed to millions of people who lived it. And that's something that can't be taken back. And I feel guilty in a way that I just, when in the early part of Bernie Sanders' campaign, I just condemned it. I was just like, oh, this guy's not a real socialist. Well, it doesn't matter. Abraham Lincoln did not want to abolish slavery. He took office. He said explicitly he was not going to abolish slavery. He just didn't want it to expand. He said the new states that were coming into the USA couldn't be slave states, but he did not want to abolish slavery. But the slave owners were so upset by the fact that he got elected that they took up arms and revolted against the federal government. A war took place, and in order to win that war, Abraham Lincoln was forced to abolish slavery. I mean, Lincoln was a racist. He did not have good intentions, ultimately. I mean, I guess he didn't personally believe in slavery, but he was not going to abolish it. But material circumstances forced him to act in a different way. And Karl Marx supported Abraham Lincoln, and his supporters campaigned for him. And there was actually a general in the Union Army named August Willock, who was a member of the Communist or the International Working Men's Association, was a Marxist, and he was a general in the Union Army. And that Marx urged his followers to support Abraham Lincoln, even though Abraham Lincoln was not a socialist, not a communist, not a revolutionary at all. But Marx understood the class forces that were taking place in the United States. And that's very, very powerful. And I feel like, when I first became a Marxist, I was looking at things like religion. I was like, oh, I'm going to learn the rules. It's going to be a rule book. But then as I started to read the history of the United States in particular and study what Marxists had done throughout U.S. history, I came to understand that this is a science and that things are not always so clear. Abraham Lincoln said that if he could not have freed a single slave, he wouldn't have done it, right? But that didn't matter because Abraham Lincoln ultimately abolished slavery and led a huge, huge mobilization of the population. What Karl Marx called it the Second American Revolution, to abolish slavery. And that's how material forces work, and that things are not always so clear. And people can say one thing and do one thing, but material conditions can force them to do another.
No, I definitely do agree with that. I saw a lot of the anti-slavery stuff was coming out of the financial North as opposed to the industrial South. I think that was largely getting rid of the last kind of quasi-remnants of feudalism within the United States. I mean, the economic engine of the country at the time was the agricultural South that was based on slavery. And in order to move into a real, much more fully capitalist phase of development, they had to get rid of the indentured slavery. And so it's like one of those things where I definitely do see it as a struggle between two groups of capitalists, but one that forwarded the capitalist system itself, more like pushed along the path of development.
Well, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a member of the Communist Party, he wrote a lot about the Civil War, and he analyzed it in great depth. And he talked about, this question. And the thing was, you're right, capitalism works better with wage labor than with slavery, right? But here's the problem. If you have capitalists who own millions of slaves, and they're not going to just go, oh, you know what? I have this property, this human property that is worth so much money. You're right. It's a better way to run the system. I'm just going to give it all up. That wouldn't happen. And the weird thing
tell
was,
Keynes that.
Right, that in the South at the time they were realizing, yes, that slavery is not exactly working with the new means of production and stuff. So they started doing weird things. They had slave factories in some southern cities where they had factories where the slaves were working. They weren't getting paid wages, and they were being driven to work harder simply by the threat of being beaten. And they were trying because the slave owning capitalists wanted to preserve their property. They didn't want to give it up. There was, and the other thing was that, in the North you had industrial capital, the people that, were steel mills, oil wells, but finance capital in Wall Street was actually supportive of slavery because finance, that's banking. And they were insuring the ships that were transporting cotton to Britain. And British capitalists were the primary supporters of slavery because they were having the Industrial Revolution and the textile industry, and they needed cheap cotton. And the South, with slave labor, was a source of cheap cotton for the British textile industry. And Marx's followers in Britain, one of the things that they did is they led union workers in Britain to refuse to work with cotton that had been picked by slaves, and say that, out of solidarity with the people of the United States, with the black people of the United States, we are not going to work with any cotton that is picked by slaves. And that was a huge act of solidarity that took place. I mean, there's the role that Karl Marx played, someone who I don't think ever even visited the United States, the role that he played in the U.S. Civil War is dynamic. And that in itself, really kind of shows you kind of how dynamic he was. It's funny. I tell people in the United States, there's all this stuff about, you'll hear from the right wing, they'll call Democrats communists. Well, Karl Marx was basically a Republican. The only job he ever had was that he was the London correspondent for the New York Tribune, which was the Republican Party newspaper of New York City back in the 1850s.
Yep,
so Karl Marx was a Republican.
I have a book with all of his articles in it.
Yeah, I mean, so Karl Marx he wasn't just a Republican, he was what they called a radical Republican. It kind of shows when people want to talk about the Democrats being the party of the Klan, well, they are, and the Republicans the party of Karl Marx, but neither are that anymore. History changes, so there you go.
Yeah, that's definitely some definitely good points.
No, I mean, this is what being a Marxist is about. I mean, it's about understanding how the world works, seeing the contradictions, and striving to make a better world. I mean, people don't get this. I feel like this is lost, and it worries me quite a bit. But is there any other topics you wanted to get to here? I mean, I'm having a great time.
Nothing really. Is there anything off the top of your head?
I don't know. I mean, are you getting? I guess this is live. Are you getting comments or people saying stuff?
Yeah, but I wouldn't take many of those comments too seriously.
Oh, YouTube, right?
Yeah, boy. YouTube gonna be what it's gonna be.
Oh boy, I'm sure I'll have a great time reading it after this. It's great.
It's not as bad as I would have expected.
Okay. Yeah, well, I can go for a little while longer, but I mean, I'm just having a good time chatting with you. But I feel like, that we always need to be looking toward the future. It's kind of tragic because, in the, there's a book called, there's a writer that I really like. Her name is Anna Louise Strong. Have you ever heard of her?
Yes.
Yeah, she interviewed Mao. She's an American journalist. She interviewed Mao, and she was a communist. She lived in the Soviet Union, and she actually wrote a memoir about how she became a communist. It's called I Change Worlds, and it's just a beautiful book, because she talks about how she was in Seattle, and she was in the Socialist Party, and there were a lot of strikes, and then she eventually moved to the Soviet Union. And one of the things she talks about, she said she felt like the Soviet Union was the new America. And she talked about how, in U.S. history, there's always this drive, to go out and create new businesses and, and go to the new land. And she talks about that slogan, "Go West, young man." Have you ever heard of that? "Go West, young man." It was Horace Greeley. It was kind of a thing. It was like, you know, and the USA always had this kind of like, we are going to move into the future. We're going to advance technology. We're going to civilize. We're going to drive. It was like entrepreneurship. And the problem, though, with "Go West, young man" is, what did "Go West" mean? It meant slaughtering Native people. You know, I mean, you know, yes, there might have been progress that was going on, but it was on the backs of slaves.
Yeah,
right?
Sunday shoots and all that.
Yeah, I mean, she wasn't, I mean, when she talks about the American spirit, I mean, she's talking about a desire to build a better life and all that, but to do it at the expense of other people, right? That's what's missing in her analysis. And when she was in the Soviet Union, she said, oh, the Soviet Union is the new America. She said, look, these people, the 5-year plans, they're building, they're developing. This this impoverished country is becoming a superpower, and they're breaking through in science. She said the Soviet Union is the new America. But what was missing from that was that the Soviet Union, you could say that at that time in the world, it was the new America, but it was not at anyone's expense. They weren't colonizing other people. They weren't exploiting people. They weren't they were making breakthroughs and advancing, but they weren't terrorizing people. They weren't murdering people in the process. And that was the difference. And I feel like that's missing. And that the USA, at this point, I mean, our economy is crumbling. And there was a time where we were advancing as a country and all that, but it was always at the expense of others. At the same time, we had this booming economy in the 50s. They were murdering people in Korea, millions of people killed in the Korean War, millions of people killed in the Vietnam War, coups in Latin America. So many people were being killed. And that all of that wealth that we acquired in our golden age and, in the time when we were, quote unquote, great, all of that came at the expense of so much suffering around the world. And, it's funny. I mean, I'm not a Muslim, but in the Islamic tradition, they talk about the concept of haram. You know this concept, haram?
Yeah, forbidden.
Yeah, well, and the way
Generally
it was explained
speaking
to me in the Shia tradition is that this argument that if something is acquired in an immoral way, that it becomes tainted. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, and that they argue if you steal food, that food might make you sick. If you have a loan that violates the Islamic law to buy your house, that house might catch on fire or something. That if something is acquired in a way that is immoral, it becomes tainted. And the wealth that we in the United States had in the 1950s and the 60s and the 70s up into the 90s, that wealth was acquired at the expense of other people. It was acquired in an impure way, and it was cursed because ultimately it couldn't last forever, right? And that that needs to be recognized. And I feel like a lot of leftists, when they hear Donald Trump say he wants to make America great again, it just hurts them in their stomach because it's not acknowledging the reality that it was the slaughter of Native Americans, the slavery, the genocide, all these brutal wars. That's what created making America, quote unquote, great in the 1950s. And that if you're an intelligent person who's read history, you know that. And when you hear people, just talking America is the greatest country in the world, you hear that and it just angers you and it upsets you. And you just have this gut reaction to it. Like, this is not right. I want to tell people that this is wrong. Right. And so it makes sense that if somebody is discovering the truth about the world, that patriotism and the idea of loving America and all that just irks you. It just gets on your nerves. I can totally understand that. However, at the same time, if we're going to try and build these kind of politics among people in the United States, we can't do it by telling them to go screw themselves. I mean, it's the truth. I mean, we need to find the good parts of the American people. At the same time slavery was going on in the United States, there were slave revolts all the time. Nat Turner. There were abolitionist movements, huge, organized movements. John Brown, people organizing against slavery. At the same time, all these ugly wars were going on in Vietnam and World War I and all that. There were people that were opposing those wars and taking great risks to oppose the war because they knew that it was immoral. There's a whole history of the labor unions organizing in the United States. And if there's going to be a change in the United States, it's not going to come by telling people screw America. It's going to come by telling people that there is a dark side to America's history and that's what we need to get rid of. But there is good within the American people, and that good will be the basis of building a new America that's not tainted by this ugly history of colonialism and mass murder and suffering, but a new America based on solidarity and brotherhood and kindness. That's the understanding that could build a new America, right? And that you have to find something within the people that you're trying to organize in order to make them feel good about themselves and to understand. You don't organize people by telling them to hate themselves.
No, you don't. I've always said that there's this whole idea of what is. There's a difference between black liberation and hating white people. Like there is a difference, and of course you're instantly labeled racist if you disagree with that. It's one of those where if you want a group of people to change their behavior, you have to go about it in a way that would facilitate that.
Yeah.
Like I can understand someone who doesn't hold a Marxist opinion, and they're going to have the opinion of just kill whitey, whatever. But that's the conclusion that their ideology draws. Okay, fine. My problem is with when people claim to be Marxist and come to the same wrong conclusion.
Well, I guess my issue more than anything, and I will say this, I've been widely attacked for comments I've made about how Marxists relate to the issue of race. And my position has always been, or not hasn't always been, it's changed over the years, but ultimately the essence of the position that I'm attacked for is this. The black community in the United States has made it abundantly clear that they do not want to join a communist party controlled by white people. They've made that abundantly clear.
Definitely. I think Bob Avakian hasn't gotten that message
yet. No comment. But they've made that abundantly clear, right? But so much of the time that I was involved in certain Marxist organizations in the United States, all I did was go to the black community that has said that they don't want to join our group and try to pander to them and try to recruit them to join my group, which was, they had African-American members, but ultimately it was overwhelmingly majority white. And it was really weird. And if you look at it, almost every communist group in the United States, that's what they do. Meanwhile, in the black community, you do have nationalists and leftist organizations that are black-oriented, like the New Black Panther Party, like the Nation of Islam, like the All African People's Revolutionary Party. And they're organizing their people, and they say to white people, why don't you go organize all those white people that are voting for Trump? Why don't you convince them to be anti-imperialist or anti-racist? And it's a fair question,
Yeah.
and that unfortunately, and I am going to get so much hate. I've said it before. A very large percentage of the American Marxist movement has a white savior complex. They don't really ultimately want to challenge the system of capitalism, which is the source of so much racism and suffering. They want to be remembered as the good white people that opposed racism. That's what they want to be remembered as, and that's not what we need right now. I mean, the black community do not need white Marxists to show up and rescue them. What is needed now more than ever is that the people that are losing their jobs and homes and seeing their standard of living decline in white America to not be utilized for fascism and hate. That's what's needed right now. The fact that that people in Ohio and Kentucky and Iowa and places like that need to understand that hating black people and hating immigrants is not going to bring their jobs back.
No, it's not. And I've always tried to I've always tried to say this, and I still get called racist for it. Yes, black people are oppressed. I mean, there's no denying that. High levels of police brutality, police killings. I'm not denying that. But you're never going to find a solution for that under capitalism.
That's an argument to be made. And that, Huey Newton, the founder of the Black Panther Party, he had a very interesting theory called intercommunalism. There was like a split from the Black Panthers. There's a guy named Eldridge Cleaver who advocated like ultra-left adventurism, right? And he was like, they had a split in like 1969. But Huey Newton was the ultimate leader of the Black Panthers. And he argued, he said, the Black Panthers are a party that's exclusively black. He said, but we want to form organizations in every community in the United States. They started like the Young Lords, which is Puerto Rican Americans. They started the Brown Berets, which was for the Chicano Americans. They worked with the American Indian movement of Native Americans. They even had a group called Young Patriots that was white Americans. And the idea was that all of these different groups would organize themselves first and then come into a coalition, a rainbow coalition together that would form the basis of a revolutionary party in which all of them were represented. That was his theory. That was the Black Panthers' theory. That's very interesting.
I would call that correct.
Yeah, well, I mean, and it points toward this understanding of the question I was always grappling with. Why am I always in the black community trying to tell black people to become members of a white communist party? Why was I doing that? And Huey Newton knew that that was not a realistic strategy. If he thought that was the correct thing, he would have not done the Black Panthers. He would have just joined some white communist group. But he had this understanding that only because of the conditions of racism in the United States, only black people could organize other black people. And that eventually, yes, there would be some kind of united front. Eventually, there would be a party formed that represented all these different groups. But the basis, it couldn't be that way. And it's interesting because it's not worth getting into too much. But there was something called the New Communist Movement of the 1970s. Are you familiar with that?
A little bit, but I know very little.
They were Maoists. I mean, it was basically, the Communist Party USA, was aligned with the Democratic Party, but China was, the new revolutionary beacon. And there was this upsurge in the 1960s. So in the 70s, there was this attempt by various people in the USA to form a new communist party. And they were Maoists, and they went into factories. They went into factories, steel factories, other things. And they tried to form a new communist party. Like it would be like a version of CPUSA that was still on the revolutionary road. And they did this for about a decade. And there's a lot of histories written about it, a lot of interesting books written about what they did. But ultimately, throughout the 1970s, you had all these 60s radicals. They went into factories and they tried to recruit people. I mean, they formed the Revolutionary Communist Party was formed, the Communist Workers' Party, the October League was formed. All these different communist groups were formed during that period. But none of them succeeded. They all ultimately failed. And the reason that they failed was because most workers in the USA at that time had a very high standard of living and didn't want to hear it. They said, look, they were patriotic, they were right wing, and that there were some successes in Detroit among the black workers. The Dodge Revolutionary Union movement and groups like that. There was success among the black workers. The black workers were open to it, but the white working class largely wanted nothing to do with these Marxists. And then, as the 1970s came to a close, in 1978, you had a revolution in Afghanistan. 79, you had the Iranian Revolution, the Nicaraguan Revolution. Plus, you had the first big economic downturn since the Second World War. And all these Marxists were really excited. They said, okay, well, finally, now the white working class is going to get it. This is our moment. There's this revolutionary upsurge around the world, and the white working class, they're finally seeing their standard of living. So now, coming into the 1980s, finally it's going to happen. And it got worse because of Reaganism, right? Because the first instinct, if you've been having your standard of living going up since, the end of the Second World War, and finally, it starts to drop in 1978, you're not going to say, oh, we need a whole new system. You're going to say, oh, we need to go back to the 1950s. And that's what the American white working class thought. They said, oh, our standard of living is going down. It's because of the hippies. It's because of the 60s. We're going to, Reagan, who was the first one to say, make America great again. They followed Reagan, and they became even more right wing. And that was so demoralizing for those Maoists and the 1960s, 70s activists that at that point there was a retreat, a retreat. Every communist group stopped trying to organize the white working class. They basically declared, look, the white working class are just reactionary, and this proves it, and they did something else. The RCP declared that only what they call the lumpen proletariat was revolutionary. Some groups went into the college campuses and started recruiting. Some groups, they got jobs in the labor union bureaucracy and kind of, organized within that. Some groups just started selling a lot of books and organizing on the campuses. But they all declared that, average Americans have no revolutionary potential, and they backed away, right? And at that time, that was probably, it might have been the right thing to do. I don't know. I wasn't there. I wasn't born yet. But we're in a period now where things are drastically different, and there is potential to bring a socialist message to the broad masses of the American people. But the leftist groups are all operating as if it's still 1978. You know what I mean? And that's a problem. What have you read about the new communist movement of the 70s?
Really not very much. You've already just said more than I ever heard. And then I would also add in the tremendous kick in the teeth the early 90s were with the complete destruction of the Eastern Bloc. That was demoralizing even more. So like it was really like, the kick while you're already down.
Sure, and I think that's why a lot of the leftist groups have become so cultish. All the world was turning against the way they thought it should be going. And, and when a young person sees an old communist with gray hair or whatever selling, a copy of the Workers this or the Revolutionary that, or, they see a person, and they see that trauma. They may not know what it is, but they're seeing that trauma of decades of seeing things go the opposite of the way they want. And they're seeing that pain. And that's why young people look, even though young people in the U.S. polls show that young people are very interested in socialism and communism right now. But the communist groups are getting weaker and decaying. And I think it's because when young people see these groups, they're seeing all that baggage from everything you're just describing, from the 80s, from the 90s. They're seeing that. And it's not something, they see that kind of, just the pain of being beaten down for so many years, so many decades. That's what makes them kind of want to turn away. And ultimately what needs to happen is there needs to be, and I'm excited, what excites me more than anything is, there's groups across the USA that are forming, that are young people that are interested in communism, but they're not joining any of these stodgy old parties, Like there's a bunch of them. I mean, you can see them on the internet, little kind of parties that are formed. Everyone in them is like under the age of 30. And they're young people that are getting into communism, but they just have a feeling that, joining this group or that group that's been around since the 70s, that's not right for us. We're going to do our own thing. That excites me. That really excites me.
No, I mean, more people coming into the movement in general is definitely a good thing. There's no questioning that.
Yeah, but coming in and not, and just having the right instinct and realizing that these older groups, that there's something not right and we want to try to do our own thing. That I respect more than anything. 'Cause I spent a long time in a particular communist organization, and I really tried. I really believed that group, would be the answer. And it took me a long time to realize that group wasn't going to go anyplace. And it took me a long time to come to that conclusion. And even after I realized that, I still was in the group for a couple more years, hoping that maybe somehow things could turn around. But they wouldn't. And then my career started to advance. I started, people like my writing or my speaking. So I was moving ahead in the world, and the group was just becoming more and more angry with me for that. They wanted me to just, be failing and be a member of their group. And ultimately, I had to go my separate ways, and I've done a lot of thinking since then. There's a group of young people called Students and Youth for a New America, and I talk with them, I engage with them. They're great young people, and I talk with them. But I'll talk to anybody. Anyone wants to talk to me. I mean, people Facebook message me all the time around the country. Hey, I'm in Iowa, I'm in Indiana, I'm in California. I like your videos. I want to talk to you. I'll talk to them. I have Marxist ideas, and they're interested in those ideas. I'll engage with them. I don't have a problem with that.
And I get that too.
And I mean, it's a weird period that we're in, and I think that, I think things are going to change, but that it's just a matter of, the first world left, and the first world left has been very much co-opted by imperialism. And, the left at one point was at least anchored by the Soviet Union or by the Eastern Bloc and even, take Syria, for example. I've been using that example, right? In Syria, you have an anti-imperialist government. They're not Marxists. They're Ba'ath Arab socialists. The left in general supports overthrowing it. The USA is funding terrorists and extremists that are trying to overthrow it. And most leftists think it's the Syrian revolution, and they support it. But if you look at Nicaragua in the 80s, in Nicaragua, you had an anti-imperialist government that they didn't call themselves Marxists. They were the Sandinistas. They were, like liberation theology Christians. And the USA was, sending guns and weapons to terrorists trying to overthrow it. But the left in the USA supported the government of Nicaragua. And a lot of leftists didn't like the Sandinistas. They said, oh, the Sandinistas aren't real true communists. But they still understood that it was not right for the USA to try to overthrow them, And that's kind of lost now, that kind of basic anti-imperialist understanding that even if we don't like somebody, even if we think this government's corrupt, they're not true Marxists or whatever, that imperialism and Western capitalism will always make it worse. That's kind of missing right now. And I think that's because the Soviet Union's gone. And I think it's because, the left has been co-opted. And at this point, when Western capitalism, engages in regime change, it often does it under left-wing auspices. I mean, Bush said he was invading Afghanistan to liberate women, right? I mean, it's like, no, I mean...
No, I know he did.
Right. And things are far, far worse for all Afghan women and all Afghan men, too. I mean, the country, since the U.S. invaded, the country has been in nothing but chaos and instability. It's now the heroin capital of the world. I mean, it's been a chaos. But the way that the regime change operation was justified was with this left wing. It was about feminism. Bush was a radical feminist, going to free these women from this awful sexist government, I mean, that wouldn't have happened during the Cold War. They would have said, oh, they're communists. They're not Christians, but now now, that kind of liberal, I wouldn't call them leftist, but or liberal, like non-Marxist left ideas have kind of become, the ideology of a big section of American capitalism. We're seeing that the left itself has kind of been co-opted. Meanwhile, a lot of anti-imperialist governments are socially conservative, and they tell their populations that they're protecting them not just from Western capitalism and privatizations, but also from gay marriage and attacks on their traditional culture and their religion. So we're seeing, countries around the world that are anti-capitalist and against Western capitalism are not espousing socially liberal ideas and are often very socially conservative. Meanwhile, Western capitalism is presenting itself as left-wing. And that's a change. That's not what we're used to. And ultimately, it begs the question, should Marxists consider themselves to be part of the left in the Western world, or should they become a different entity? If the left is more supportive of imperialism and more supportive of Western capitalism dominating the world, should you as a legitimate socialist or Marxist be on the left?
That is a good question, and I think a trend in that is called ideological hypocrisy, or screw it, let's just call it hypocrisy, or at least a double standard. Because I've heard people say, well, gays in Syria or trans in Syria, etc., don't have things very good, so smash the government of Assad. Yet turn around and say, PFLP for life. Like, I mean, do you really think things are really that great for gays or trans in Palestine? I mean, it's not exactly one of the most progressive states, but there's a definite double standard. Why is it unforgivable to support the Assad government against, or the Syrian people against imperialism, use imperialism there, but it's okay to support the Palestinian resistance? I mean, there's just so much ideological inconsistency.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Ridiculous. It's interesting if you look at the left. I have to say this, but Al Jazeera, right? Al Jazeera is that's Qatar. You know what I mean? Yeah. And the Qatari perspective. The Qatari government supports the Muslim Brotherhood. The Turkish government supports the Muslim Brotherhood, and that the Muslim Brotherhood is anti-Israel. But the Muslim Brotherhood is also anti-Assad. They're anti-Iran. They're against the government of al-Sisi in Egypt. And the Muslim Brotherhood has one axis within the Middle East. And it's mainly been aligned with the United States, but now there's this falling out between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. And so that puts that in question. And we're seeing Turkey is a little bit more neutral than it used to be. And it's not exactly clear. But it's a little weird, because you do see sections of the U.S. left that kind of mirror those positions, and they at the same they support they're supporting opposition to Israel and Palestinian resistance, but they're opposed to all the other governments in the region, except they never will criticize Qatar or Turkey. And you have to wonder, is that almost an axis? I know that I know that that various figures, it's a little bizarre, because I just got to say it's a little bit bizarre. You see a parallel between a lot of American leftists and between the Muslim Brotherhood and the Qatari axis, you know what I mean, and the Turkey-Qatar axis in the Middle East, and that they tend to almost kind of follow behind each other. And I think that's a little bit strange. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, no, I definitely do see that.
Yeah, it's just a little bizarre, and I've noticed that parallel, that and I wonder what that's about. I wonder why that certain positions mimic other positions, but ultimately it doesn't matter. But at the end of the day, I think that Ba'ath Arab socialism is very interesting. I think that Michel Aflaq is an interesting character, and that he was a communist originally. And then when when communists were instructed to align with French imperialism against fascism during World War II, he was a Syrian. He was in Syria, and the French were his colonizer. So he rejected Marxism at that point and had invented his own ideology called Ba'ath Arab socialism. I think that's very interesting, right? I mean, I'm not Arab, Ba'ath Arab socialism is not anything that's meant for me, and I'm not a Ba'athist. But I think it's interesting. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what I think of it, because everyone can agree that Saddam Hussein, they had a Ba'athist government. The USA went in there, and things in Iraq have been far, far worse ever since. Libya, they had the Islamic Socialist government. The USA went in there, bombed the place to ruin, overthrew, the Islamic Socialist government, and things got far, far worse. Afghanistan, they had the Taliban. USA went in there, and things are far, far worse. None of these countries get any better off. I mean, if it's about rescuing the people, they never get any better off. So, you can say, well, this government is bad and that government bad. You might be right. You might be wrong. I haven't done the research, and we know they lie all the time. A lot of the stuff they were saying about Gaddafi during the Libyan war has been disproven. But regardless, even if Gaddafi was awful, no one would say that the people of Libya are better off now. They didn't have chattel slavery under Gaddafi. They've got that now in Libya. Things are so bad in Libya, people are piling onto rafts and trying to get to Italy and get away from how bad things are. So I don't think anyone in their right minds would try to say that things were better off. And so even people who abhor these governments should be opposed to toppling the regimes. And furthermore, the USA is supposed to be fighting a war on terror. And, the narrative, the official story of 9/11 is that we were attacked by Al-Qaeda on 9/11. Well, you'll notice that throughout the war on terror, we haven't been fighting Al-Qaeda. We've been fighting enemies of Al-Qaeda, right? The Syrian government is very, very hostile to Al-Qaeda. They were the first to say they supported the war on terror. Gaddafi was a big supporter of the war on terror. Saddam Hussein was a big supporter of the war on terror. They've been fighting Al-Qaeda for years. Al-Qaeda was always understood to be aligned with Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden's family is one of the richest families in Saudi Arabia. So Al-Qaeda was always considered to be an enemy of these governments. But, and Al-Qaeda was always considered to be rooted in the Wahhabi ideology, which is in Saudi Arabia. So the USA didn't invade Saudi Arabia. The USA invaded it didn't invade the countries that have links to Al-Qaeda. It invaded all the countries that are fighting against Al-Qaeda. It's almost as if the USA has been operating as Al-Qaeda's air force in the Middle East. I mean, the whole thing is it's not a war on terror. It's not a humanitarian intervention to rescue people. What is going on? Why is the USA taking this action? Ultimately, it's because these countries are independent countries and they're competitors. That's what it's about. Imperialism is about maintaining a monopoly for Western capitalism and corporations. All these countries, most of them are oil exporting countries that are selling oil on the international markets in competition with Wall Street and London-based oil bankers. That's what's going on. I mean, this is, Iraq was selling oil. It was a huge oil selling country. Now it's blown to bits. A major oil producing country blown to bits. And they're selling, at this point, they're producing only 10% of the amount of oil they were producing under Saddam Hussein. Great. So all the people that used to be buying oil from Iraq, 90% of that oil that used to be purchased from Iraq is now purchased from American bankers. And you look at all the countries the USA doesn't like, they all are competitors economically. Russia is a giant oil and natural gas country. They sell huge amounts of oil, huge amounts of natural gas. They're the second in natural gas, I believe. They're the top in oil production in the entire world. So, of course, we hate Russia. Venezuela, they have more oil reserves in Venezuela now than in Saudi Arabia. Of course we hate them.
Producer.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's what this is ultimately about. And China would love to get along with the United States. They are all about, they love American companies going there and doing business. They are totally friendly. But at the end of the day, China produces half the steel in the world. They have the biggest telecommunications manufacturer in the world. It's producing the biggest, number of cell phones in the world. They produce half the copper in the world. And every amount of steel and copper and every Huawei cell phone, they're not buying it from American companies. And that's ultimately what this is about. There's a big campaign in Angola against Isabel dos Santos. And she's the daughter of the president of Angola for a long time, who was a leader of the guerrilla group that fought against the Portuguese and established the Marxist government there in Angola, the MPLA, the Movement for the Liberation of People of Angola. And she's the richest woman in Africa. But there's a campaign against her in the media because she was running the state-run oil company. And they're saying, her turgid bureaucracy, was crippling the ability to do joint ventures with American oil companies. So all the American oil companies pulled out. And they said, she was not privatizing the natural gas. And what else did Isabel dos Santos do is she arranged for the state-run oil company in Angola to set up an independent cell phone company for Angola. So Angolans, this is a very, very poor African country. But how many poor African countries have their own cell phone company, right? Again, Angolans were using cell phones and operating on cell phone plans that weren't controlled by Western capitalism. They weren't using Verizon or AT&T. They had their own cell phone service based in an Angolan corporation using the oil profits from it. So of course there's this huge campaign against Isabel dos Santos in American media. When she was trying to get investment from American companies, she was over here in the USA and they treated her practically like royalty. There's videos of her speaking in New York City, and it was about black women's empowerment and all of that. But now that she stood up to the American oil companies in Angola, now she's on the blacklist. And now that she's set up an independent cell phone company, this is a woman who, she's a member of a Marxist party. Her father was a guerrilla fighter. And, they have a pretty market-oriented economy, but, it's a high level of state control with oil being the major thing. And now, even though she was the richest woman in Africa, even though she's tied to all kinds of American businesses, now the Western press wants to destroy her. Isn't that interesting?
Sounds about right.
Yeah, this is how imperialism works.
It is. It's about taking over. Imperialism doesn't care if you're a Democrat, a social democrat, a fascist, or a free market, fundamental marketeer. As long as you're serving the interests of U.S. capital, that's fine. That's all they need you to do.
Right. Imperialism, they overthrow countries not because of what they say, but because they exist. That's what you have to understand. They want the entire third world to be dirt poor and not producing anything, so that everyone has to buy everything from the West. That if Saddam Hussein could have said, "I love America," he could have, changed the Iraqi flag to the American flag. It wouldn't have mattered. As long as he continued selling oil on the international markets in competition with Wall Street, it didn't matter. They wanted to get rid of him. And that's what people don't seem to get. That when they call these leaders anti-American. A lot of times these leaders they call anti-American have bent over backwards to try and appease the United States, but at the end it doesn't matter.
Is it really that bad for a foreign country to be anti-American?
Is it anti-American to want to control your own economy?
Yes.
And
the answer is yes.
Well, and the thing is, though, the same people that destroyed Iraq, the same corporations that benefited from demolishing Iraq, they are destroying Iowa and Kentucky right now. They're destroying my home state of Ohio. They're dropping the standard of living. They're the reason that millennials make far lower wages than their parents. At the end of the day, people in the first world need to realize that these other countries around the world that are striving for economic independence are not their enemy. That the enemy of American people, the people driving their wages down, are much closer to home. That's the understanding that people need to have. That there is an international class of billionaire financial monopolists who want to keep the world underdeveloped because they need to maintain their monopoly. China is pushing alternative energy like crazy right now. And the reason that they're doing that is because China is an oil importing country, right? They need to import oil. And most of their oil comes through the South China Sea. And the South China Sea is a strategic location, right?
Very strategic.
Right, and they're building oil pipelines with Russia like crazy, but they still depend on oil tankers coming from the South China Sea, and because of that, they're vulnerable, because if China were to stop importing oil, their entire economy would shut down. They need oil to keep running their economy, and that's a weakness that they have, right? So China is pushing alternative energy. But the imperialists don't want alternative energy because they control, for the most part, except for, Russia and Venezuela and places like that, they control the oil markets. They want to keep us on an oil economy. China, on the other hand, wants us to get beyond the oil economy because the oil economy keeps them, under the domination of imperialism. That the oil economy is bad for the environment. It's creating global warming. And it's also holding back the means of production. It's not good for the world economy to continue to have oil-based production. We need new energy more than ever. We need it like crazy. But in order to do that, that'll mean the Wall Street oil billionaires and the British oil billionaires losing their monopoly on oil. And so we have, every effort is being made to maintain the oil-based economy.
Well, it's not like the whole world is going to die or anything. Oh, wait, yeah, it is.
Yeah.
If there was a better symbol for capitalism, I couldn't think of it. I think that the oil industry and like that is just the perfect symbol for capitalism. Literally going to murder the entire planet.
And, oddly, and this may come as a surprise to some people, but oil had a lot to do with the Russian Revolution. At the time of the Russian Revolution, Azerbaijan, which at that point was, was a colony of Russia, was the major oil production center in the world. There was more oil coming out of Azerbaijan than the entire United States at that time. right? So when the Bolsheviks had their revolution, the British sent troops to Azerbaijan to seize the oil fields because they wanted to make sure that those oil fields, remained under British control. And the Bolsheviks sent their army in, and a lot of the fighting in the Russian Civil War was in Azerbaijan because Russia was the oil producing center of the world, of Europe at least at that time. And that had a lot to do with it. And, the Saudi Arabia wouldn't even exist as a country if it weren't for oil. Right. I mean, you go back before the Second World War, Saudi Arabia, there was nothing there, but the British had this alliance with the House of Saud, and they built them up and saw them as kind of useful allies. They armed them. They trained them. They ended up conquering the entire or most of the Arabian Peninsula. Saudi Arabia is a product of Western oil capitalists. It was a small, monarchy that had been around that the British discovered as useful allies. That's where the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia came from. And it's, all this talk about human rights. The only country in the world that still cuts off people's heads in public is Saudi Arabia. So anytime you hear any American leader lecture the world on human rights, just say Saudi Arabia. That should end the conversation right there. They sell Saudi Arabia loads of weapons. Trump and Obama both were dancing around and shaking hands and friendly buddy with the Saudi king. So anything we say about Iran, anything, we say about Venezuela, it's 1,000 times more true about Saudi Arabia. But we're okay with that because they are a puppet of Western oil companies.
And that's one of the big hypocrisies about Canada. I mean, we do have a very smug aspect to us that we're like America, but we're not like them. We believe in peacekeeping, not policing, which is the same thing. Essentially, it's the same thing. Oh, we're not like them. We don't do deals. A dictator sells weapons to Saudi Arabia and then has our prime minister walking around claiming to be a feminist. I'm not really sure how that math works out in his head, but there's always a very self-righteous flavor from it from the U.S., but with Canada, it's more of a smugness. The belief that we're somehow better because we're like the U.S., a Western liberal democracy, but we're not like them. But in some of the most horrible ways, yeah, we kind of are. And we would be just as much of a terror upon the world if we had the financial and resource ability to do so. But we always like to have that little smug sense of self-superiority that we're not.
Yeah, I think that, in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union, I think that Lenin's book Imperialism needs to be revisited because Lenin's theory of imperialism is ultimately correct in this understanding that that Western bankers want to dominate the world economy. However, there's one thing about it that's not exactly true any longer, which is if you read about it, Lenin argues against a guy named Kautsky, who was arguing that there was ultra-imperialism and there were no more imperialist rivalries at that time, and that it was, all the imperialist countries against the third world, and that's what Kautsky was arguing at that time, and obviously that was wrong. I mean, World War I, there was a huge inter-imperialist rivalry. There's no question that Kautsky was wrong and that Lenin was right when Lenin wrote that book. But if you look at it now, right, at the time that Lenin wrote Imperialism, right, the American capitalist state was fighting on behalf of American corporations. He wanted American corporations to dominate the world and make super profits from the world. And British corporations were being fought for by the British state. They wanted British corporations to run the world. French corporations, German corporations, all these capitalist states were carving out spheres of influence for their own bourgeoisie, right? That was kind of the argument. Yeah. Well, if you look at it now, I feel like there is a section of American capital that doesn't really have any particular geographic loyalty to the United States. I feel like ExxonMobil and the forces that run the Council on Foreign Relations, and they don't really have – it's not like they're fighting for American capitalism against British capitalism. I think that there is, you look at the World Trade Organization, you look at the International Monetary Fund, you look at these big, international banks, there is a very big section of capital that is so wealthy that it's almost what you could call like a supranational bourgeoisie. That they don't have any particularly, they're not loyal to one particular country within the imperialist centers. They're loyal to all of imperialism. And London and London Stock Exchange and Wall Street, I don't think they're loyal to Britain and the USA. I think they're loyal to the international capitalist system. Now, I think
Yes.
the Walton family and Sheldon Adelson, I think there are capitalists that are loyal to American imperialism only. That certainly exists. But there is a section of American capital that is very internationally interested, and that when responsibility to protect was added to the UN Charter, that was huge because essentially they were arguing, the Treaty of Westphalia talked about nation states. And now when Samantha Power and the Western countries changed it so that the UN doesn't exist just to protect the sovereignty of nation states, it also exists to protect, it has a responsibility to protect human rights, or R2P. That was kind of a breakthrough because it's a section of the bourgeoisie that doesn't believe in nations any longer. That basically says that there is, there's this international rule, there's this international order that should be protected, and we can violate a country's sovereignty if necessary in order to enforce this international order. And that was a change. That was a big game change. And that the Democratic Party, some of the forces in the Tory party in Britain, a lot of different forces and a lot of different parties in the Western countries are loyal to what they call the open international system. They're not exactly loyal to a particular capitalist country and its sphere of influence. And that's something that Lenin didn't write about. And I think that came about after the fall of the Soviet Union. I think that the fall of the Soviet Union kind of unleashed a section of Western capitalism along with the computer revolution that kind of changed their relationship to the nation state.
Yeah, that actually kind of reminds me. You know who Annie Applebaum is?
No.
Oh, New York Times writer. She wrote yes, she was the one who wrote Gulag Archipelago, I think.
Oh, I thought that was Solzhenitsyn.
Then it wasn't Gulag Archipelago. She wrote another thing about the gulags.
Okay.
Anyway, she's a New York Times writer, and she wrote a piece complaining about how we need to have stricter controls upon financial capital. And she was complaining about how a lot of their head offices and quarters are in other countries, not just other countries, but a multitude of countries at the same time. As you were saying, capital is now international. And she lamented about how it was beyond the democratic control of the United States government. Like the American voter or the American government couldn't place restrictions on these headquarters because they weren't a part of it. It's amazing how in her mind she essentially described that capital was beyond the democratic control of people, but then went on to assert, but then is rabidly anti-communist and went on to assert how capitalism is democracy. Like, she can't even see how she so blatantly contradicted herself. It was astounding.
I mean, it's the saddest thing. I feel like there's a million curveballs. When I was a college student, getting into Marxist ideas and such, I remember like the rise of Ron Paul came. And all these people who had never questioned American capitalism, loved the Iraq War, loved Bush, all of a sudden Ron Paul came along and they're like, yeah, the wars are bad, the system is bad. That's because it's communist. We need real capitalism, Or, anti-Semitism. That's a big thing. There's a lot of people that are like, yeah, these wars are bad and somebody else rules. But the problem isn't the capitalism. It's just one ethnic group. It's people of Jewish heritage. They're the problem. Well, no. I mean, there's always something to make people. And ultimately, it's a way that people cannot question capitalism and just question, just blame something else. Right? And conspiracy theories, I mean, Freemasons, groups like that, do they have power? I don't know. But at the end of the day, the problem is capitalism. It's not some group. It's not some thing high up on a thing. At the end of the day, the problem is the way the economies and the way the governments work, not some shady group that's hiding someplace sacrificing goats or something.
No, that's one of the points that I've always tried to make about conspiracy theories, about Ron Paul, about Alex Jones. There is always the definite anything but capitalism. It's the fault of anything but. And I think this comes from an inability of a lot of these people to be able to criticize and analyze systems. They do not understand how a system works. So anytime it does something beyond their perception of what it should do, it must therefore always be some kind of pervasive outside influence that's making it not what it is. Whether it's the reptiles, the Jews, the Satanists, or the secret communists that are running things, or the Federal Reserve is controlling our lives. It's always You always look at these people and you can see that they never criticize the system, or even criticize the way it functions, or even even for the most part, the ideological basis for systems. And thus, it has to be some kind of outside force that's causing the problem. It's never something about the way something functions. It's never about what the market does. It's not something that can happen as a result of the profit motive or the virtue of greed. Yeah, they have a vision of what it should be, or what they think it is. And if it does not conform to that, it's some kind of conspiracy. It's always an outside invading force. It's never a problem with the system itself, or maybe some kind of inconsistency or fully understanding how something functions.
Yeah, I mean, it's sad. But and the thing is, it's not to say that conspiracies don't happen. There are plenty of times that capitalists get together and try to do something. But you have to ask yourself, why are they doing that? Well, they're doing it to advance their own interests. They're doing it to make profits. And, it's like you don't need a complicated story. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, my understanding of what's wrong, with the world today is that it's dominated by a group of rich people, and they own and control the major means of production, the major centers of economic power, and they operate them not for the benefit of all, but for the benefit of trying to make profits for themselves. I mean, it's not that complicated. It's not, there's no secret books. There's no, I mean, it just seems like common sense. If most of the centers of economic power are controlled by a small group of people, and they use them to make more money for themselves, they're going to do things to make more money for themselves. I mean, it's not that hard. I mean, it's not that complicated. It's far more simple. It's far more obvious, I would think, but people go to great lengths to try to come up with, a very complicated story about who rules the world, so that they can, and when it gets down to it, it's so they can still believe the ideology that's being pushed on them by the people that rule the world. They want to believe in Western liberalism. They want to believe in Western capitalism, so they go to great lengths to come up with a way that, well, this isn't real capitalism. And you don't have to go to that great lengths. The problem is profits.
Yeah, like the capitalist class, conspiracy theorists see it as a secret cabal, like one overall reaching thing. It's the Jews, or it's the Satanists. When really capitalists, while they do collaborate a lot and they do screw us on a daily basis, is the very foundation of their system. At the end of the day, they go home and they think about ways to knife each other in the back.
Sure.
So well, it's not some kind of complete, perfect being like Satan or something on the top. It's just a system.
Yeah. Well, Jason, you and I, we don't agree on a lot of things, but I think we agree on a lot. It's been a while. It's been a long time we've been on here. I am exhausted. I need to go home from my office. I'm very tired, but it has been a real pleasure. And we should do this again sometime if you'll have me. If you want to have me back on.
Yeah, definitely.
I would love to do that. I'd love to chat with you, and I feel like these conversations are very vital.
Yes.
And as much as I'm reporting the news day to day, I mean, I have my own views. I have my own perspective. When I'm a journalist, you try to put your own views aside and just report the facts. But I have my own views, and I feel like you and I, we represent a lot of younger people in the Western world who are wrangling with these questions, going, what's gone wrong? Why is it that we don't have that first world standard of living any longer? Well, and they're looking for answers. And I want to engage with those people. I just want to have a conversation because, the Western world is in a bit of a crisis. And I think that people need to be having these conversations. I'm willing to have these kind of conversations with anybody who will listen. And anyone who will educate me and inform me. I've learned a lot from this conversation too. So, let's do this again sometime if you're up for it.
Yeah, definitely. So you're going to go now?
I'm out.
Okay. Just before you go, there's Getting Rich Without Capitalism, America's Way Out, a book by Caleb Maupin that he's just released. I have a copy of it, right here. I suggest everybody will go out and get it, and I will leave a link to the book on Amazon in the description.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Jason.
No problem. See you later.
My best wishes. Keep making videos.
You too.
Keep challenging the system.